Before dawn on October 13th, 1307, the world still believed it was safe. Across France, the sky remained dark and indifferent, stars fading slowly as if reluctant to give way to morning. In monasteries, fortresses, and commanderies, men who had lived by strict routine rose for prayer, unaware that this would be the last morning of their order. The Knights Templar, once the most powerful brotherhood in Christendom, were about to be erased in a single, coordinated strike. But while history remembers the arrests on land, it whispers far more quietly about what happened at the water's edge. Along the French coast, harbors slept under a thin veil of mist. The smell of salt and wet rope hung in the air. Ships creaked gently against their moorings, lanterns swaying like tired eyes. In ports controlled by the Templars, especially at La Rochelle, something felt different that night. There was movement when there should have been none. Shadows passed between warehouses. Orders were given in hushed voices. Sails were checked, cargo secured, anchors prepared. No bells rang. No banners flew. Whatever was happening was meant to leave no trace. At the same hour, miles inland, royal officers pounded on heavy doors. Sealed letters bearing the king's mark were opened simultaneously across the realm. The instructions inside were precise and merciless. Arrest every Templar, seize their property, allow no escape. The accusations were shocking: heresy, blasphemy, secret rituals so vile they could barely be spoken aloud. Many of the soldiers carrying out these orders did not understand them. Some had fought beside these men. Others had borrowed money from them. Yet the command came from the crown itself, and hesitation was not permitted. Torches flared against stone walls as Templars were dragged from their beds. Some were confused, others defiant, a few already resigned, as if they had long expected this moment. Chains clinked, doors slammed. The sound of boots echoed through cloisters that had known only prayer and discipline. By sunrise, the order that had once stood at the heart of medieval Europe was in chains. And yet not everywhere. When royal officials reached the great Templar ports, they found something unsettling. Ships that should have been there were gone. Not damaged, not seized, gone. Mooring lines cut cleanly. Docks empty. Warehouses stripped of certain goods, but not ransacked. It was as if the sea itself had quietly swallowed them during the night. La Rochelle, the crown jewel of the Templar fleet, stood unervingly still. Chroniclers would later note the absence almost in passing, as if unsure what to make of it. But the implications were enormous. The Templars were not merely warriors. They were logisticians, bankers, administrators, and sailors. They controlled ships that carried men, money, and messages across Europe and beyond. If those ships had vanished, then something had escaped the king's grasp. The question that has echoed for more than 7 centuries is simple and deeply troubling. How? King Philip IV was many things. Ambitious, ruthless, deeply in debt, but he was not careless. The arrests had been planned in secrecy for months, perhaps longer. Even members of the royal council were kept in the dark until the last moment. Yet someone, somewhere, knew enough to act. Someone warned the order. Or perhaps the order had already prepared for this day. The Knights Templar were trained to think in terms of survival. Born in the chaos of the Crusades, they had learned early that the world could turn hostile without warning. Their rules emphasized obedience, secrecy, and unity. Information was shared carefully, often compartmentalized. It is entirely possible that only a handful of senior figures knew what was coming, and that was enough. In the final hours before the arrests, the Templars did not attempt a dramatic stand. There was no uprising, no call to arms. That absence of resistance has puzzled historians for generations. Why would an order with fortified castles, armed men, and enormous wealth surrender so completely? One possible answer lies not in what they lost, but in what they chose to save. What left those harbors that night may not have been gold alone. Treasure is heavy, difficult to move, and dangerous to transport in secrecy. But ships can carry more than metal. They can carry documents, knowledge, sacred objects, and people. They can carry the future of an idea. As dawn broke, the sea revealed nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no signs of pursuit. The ships did not return that day, nor the next, nor ever. They vanished into legend, leaving behind only questions and rumors. Some said they fled to friendly shores. Others claimed they sailed beyond the edges of the known world. Official records fell silent, as if deliberately so. On land, the destruction of the order unfolded with brutal efficiency. Under torture, men confessed to whatever was demanded of them. Property was seized, reputation shattered. The narrative of heresy took hold, repeated so often that it became accepted truth. But narratives have a way of smoothing over inconvenient details, and the missing ships were very inconvenient. Silence, in this case, may have been the point. If the Templars had escaped with something truly dangerous, something that challenged royal authority, church power, or the very structure of medieval society, then erasing their voice would be essential. History is not only written by the victors, it is also shaped by what they choose not to ask. The sea, unlike parchment, keeps its secrets well. It does not testify, it does not contradict, and it does not care about kings. As Europe watched the Templars burn, rot in prisons, or fade into obscurity, whatever left those ports moved on, unseen and unrecorded. Perhaps it fractured into pieces, hidden across nations. Perhaps it survived intact, waiting. Or perhaps its greatest strength was simply that no one could prove it ever existed. What we are left with is a haunting imbalance, a total collapse on land, and an unresolved absence at sea. An order accused of unimaginable crimes, yet disciplined enough to vanish without chaos. Ships that should have been captured, yet were not. A plan too precise to be coincidence. And so the mystery begins not with treasure maps or wild legends, but with an empty harbor at dawn, a calm sea, and the unsettling realization that history's greatest purge may have failed to destroy what it feared most. The arrests ended an order. The ships suggest that something else escaped, and whatever it was important enough to disappear forever. Long before kings feared them, before whispers of heresy and betrayal followed their name, the Knights Templar were simply a solution to a problem no one else wanted to face. In the early 12th century, Jerusalem had fallen into Christian hands, but the roads that led to the Holy City remained dangerous. Pilgrims traveled for months across unfamiliar lands, only to be robbed, enslaved, or killed within sight of the shrines they had come to worship. The victory of the Crusades had created a fragile promise, and that promise was bleeding out on dusty roads. It was in this uneasy silence, around the year 1119, that a small group of knights stepped forward. They were not powerful men. They were not wealthy. They were not famous. Led by a nobleman from Champagne named Hugues de Payens, they swore vows not only of knighthood, but of monastic devotion, poverty, chastity, obedience. They would live as monks and fight as soldiers, a contradiction that unsettled many at the time. War was a bloody trade. Monastic life was meant to renounce it. The Templars embraced both. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The name was long, humble, and intentional. Their headquarters stood on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, believed to be the site of Solomon's ancient temple. They slept in shared quarters, ate simple meals, and owned nothing individually. Early descriptions emphasize how few they were. One famous image shows two knights sharing a single horse, a symbol of their poverty that would later become their seal. For nearly a decade, they existed in obscurity. They patrolled roads, escorted travelers, and fought small skirmishes far from the glory of major battles. Many doubted their purpose. Others questioned their legitimacy. A group of armed monks did not fit neatly into the rigid categories of medieval society. But the roads grew safer. Word spread. Pilgrims began to seek them out. The turning point came when the Templars found a powerful ally in Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of his age. Bernard did not merely defend the order. He reshaped its image. In his writings, he described the Templars as a new kind of warrior, one who killed without hatred and died without fear. To fight for God, he argued, was not murder but righteousness. With Bernard's support, the Church formally recognized the order in 1129. From that moment on, everything changed. Donations began to flow in. Land, money, weapons, and men were offered by nobles eager to support a cause that promised both spiritual reward and practical benefit. A son could join the Templars and secure prayers for the family's salvation. A lord could donate land and place it under the protection of a powerful, disciplined force. Across Europe, commanderies appeared, self-contained estates that funded the order's work in the East. The Templars remained bound by their vows, but their definition of poverty was collective rather than individual. No knight owned anything, yet the order owned everything it needed. Over time, that distinction would blur in the eyes of outsiders. To peasants and kings alike, the Templars looked rich, efficient, and untouchable. They became experts at organization. Supplies were moved with precision. Accounts were kept carefully. Horses were bred, trained, and replaced systematically. Unlike feudal armies that gathered and dissolved with each campaign, the Templars were permanent. They were always ready. Their discipline set them apart on the battlefield. While other knights chased glory, Templars held formation. Retreat was forbidden unless ordered. Many died where they stood, refusing to break ranks. This earned them both admiration and unease. An army that did not panic was an army that could not be easily controlled. As their reputation grew, so did their responsibilities. They guarded fortresses, negotiated truces, and acted as intermediaries between Christian and Muslim leaders. In a world of shifting alliances, they became a constant presence. Their loyalty was not to any king, but to the order itself and to the church, at least in theory. One of their most revolutionary contributions was financial rather than military. Pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land faced the risk of carrying large sums of money. The Templars offered a solution: deposit funds at a Templar house in Europe and receive a letter of credit redeemable in the East. It was a simple idea but transformative. In effect, the Templars created an early form of international banking. Kings took notice. Monarchs borrowed from the order to fund wars, ransoms, and lavish courts. The Templars charged no interest, at least officially, but fees and services ensured their sustainability. More importantly, they became indispensable. To owe money to the Templars was to owe money to an institution protected by the Church itself. With papal support came extraordinary privileges. The Templars answered directly to the Pope, not to local bishops or secular rulers. Their lands were exempt from many taxes. Their churches could collect tithes. Their messengers traveled freely across borders. These protections were granted to help them fulfill their mission, but they also placed the order outside normal systems of control. To many rulers, this autonomy was tolerable when the Templars were useful. It became intolerable when their usefulness declined. The loss of the Holy Land in the late 13th century struck at the heart of the order's original purpose. Acre fell in 1291, ending the Crusader presence in the East. The Templars withdrew to Europe, bringing with them their surviving knights, records, and resources. They were still wealthy, still organized, still independent, but the reason for their existence had grown unclear. This ambiguity made them vulnerable. An institution created for a holy war that no longer existed had to justify itself in other ways. The Templars did not dissolve. They adapted. They managed estates, finances, and fleets. They remained powerful, but their power no longer had a clear narrative to protect it. Resentment grew quietly. Lesser nobles envied their privileges. Kings resented their independence. Clergy questioned their secrecy. Rumors began to circulate. Strange initiation rites, hidden knowledge, arrogance disguised as piety. None of this was proven, but proof was not always necessary. What made the Templars dangerous was not merely their wealth or their secrecy. It was their structure. They were a multinational organization in a world that was becoming increasingly centralized under monarchs. They moved across borders as if borders did not exist. They obeyed a chain of command that answered to no crown. By the time King Philip IV looked at the order, he did not see poor knights guarding pilgrims. He saw a rival system of power, a brotherhood forged in faith and discipline, hardened by war, and refined by administration. An institution that had learned how to survive chaos. and survival, once learned, is not easily unlearned. The Templars had been born out of necessity, shaped by belief and strengthened by time. Their vows of poverty had taught them efficiency. Their vows of obedience had taught them unity. Their vows of chastity had severed bloodlines, ensuring loyalty to the order alone. These were not weaknesses, they were advantages. When the storm finally came, it would find an order that had faced extinction before and endured. Whether by foresight, instinct, or quiet preparation, the Knights Templar had spent nearly 2 centuries learning how to exist in hostile worlds. And when that world turned against them, they would not face it as naive monks on borrowed horses, but as veterans of betrayal, already thinking several steps ahead. Power rarely announces itself all at once. It accumulates quietly, layer by layer, until one day it is simply everywhere. This was how the Knights Templar grew, not through conquest of thrones, but through mastery of systems. By the mid-12th century, they had moved beyond their original role as guardians of pilgrims and become something far more complex. An organization that understood how to move men, money, and information across a fractured continent. Europe at the time was a patchwork of feudal loyalties. Borders shifted constantly. Kings ruled in name, but real authority was fragmented among nobles, bishops, and warlords. In this chaos, the Templars offered something rare: stability. Their rules were consistent whether one stood in England, France, Italy, or the Holy Land. Their commanderies followed the same routines, kept similar records, and answered to the same hierarchy. To a world accustomed to unpredictability, this made them invaluable. Their estates were not merely religious houses. They were logistical hubs. Farms produced grain and wine. Workshops forged weapons and armor. Stables bred and trained horses. Everything served a purpose, and nothing was wasted. Surplus funded campaigns overseas. Losses were absorbed collectively. A defeat in the East did not bankrupt the order because its resources were distributed across hundreds of properties. This system required trust. A knight in Jerusalem relied on the produce of a field in Normandy he would never see. A commander in London trusted that funds deposited in Paris would be honored without question. That trust was enforced by discipline, reinforced by faith, and protected by reputation. Breaking it would unravel everything. Their financial operations became increasingly sophisticated. What began as simple safekeeping evolved into an interconnected network of accounts. Funds could be transferred between houses through coded documents and trusted couriers. Debts were recorded meticulously. Even kings, who often ruled by impulse, found themselves bound by the order's ledgers. When monarchs needed money quickly, the Templars could provide it. When ransoms had to be paid, the Templars facilitated the transfer. When treaties required guarantees, the Templars stood as witnesses. In doing so, they embedded themselves into the machinery of governance without ever wearing a crown. This invisible authority was perhaps their greatest strength. Unlike nobles, they did not pass power through bloodlines. Unlike bishops, they did not compete openly for doctrinal dominance. Their influence flowed beneath the surface, steady and difficult to challenge. Yet influence breeds suspicion. As decades passed, the contrast between the Templars' vows and their apparent power grew harder to ignore. They spoke of poverty, yet their houses were well provisioned. They claimed humility, yet kings waited on their decisions. To outsiders, this contradiction felt dishonest. To the Templars, it was simply efficiency in service of a higher mission. Their independence from local laws deepened the unease. Papal privileges placed them beyond the reach of regional courts. If a dispute arose between a Templar house and a noble, the noble often found himself powerless. Appeals went directly to Rome, bypassing local authority. This arrangement protected the order from harassment, but it also isolated them politically. They lived among communities but were never fully part of them. They employed locals, traded goods, and offered protection, yet remained apart. Men without families, without heirs, without roots. Their loyalty was vertical, not horizontal, pointed upward to the order and ultimately to God. On the battlefield, their discipline bordered on the inhuman. Chroniclers describe moments when Templar knights stood their ground long after others fled, knowing retreat meant dishonor. This unwavering obedience was praised in sermons and feared in war councils. An enemy who would not break could only be destroyed. Their success attracted recruits from noble families across Europe. Younger sons, unlikely to inherit land, found purpose in the order. Some joined out of faith, others out of ambition, still others to escape political entanglements at home. Once inside, they were stripped of titles and possessions. The transformation was total. Over time, the Templars became less dependent on crusading fervor and more embedded in European affairs. They guarded treasuries, managed estates for absent lords, and even administered towns. Their neutrality made them ideal stewards, but neutrality itself is a form of power. It allows one to outlast rivals. By the late 13th century, this power had become conspicuous. The Order's headquarters in Paris was one of the most formidable complexes in the city, complete with fortified walls and its own treasury. Kings walked its halls as debtors, not masters. This reversal of expected hierarchy unsettled the natural order as medieval society understood it. At the same time, the ideological foundation of the Crusades was crumbling. Military defeats in the East raised uncomfortable questions. If God favored the Christian cause, why were sacred cities falling? Institutions tied to that cause, including the Templars, found themselves under scrutiny. Failure invites blame. Rumors gained traction in this climate. Secrecy became synonymous with guilt. The private initiation rituals of the Order, designed to test loyalty and discipline, were recast as evidence of heresy. Symbols were misinterpreted. Silence was read as arrogance. Yet the Templars did not change their ways. Perhaps they believed their service record spoke for itself. Perhaps they underestimated the resentment building around them. Or perhaps they understood that changing would signal weakness. What is certain is that by the time the 13th century drew to a close, the Knights Templar had achieved something few institutions ever manage. They had become essential without being accountable. They ruled no land, wore no crowns, and claimed no thrones. Yet their decisions shaped wars, economies, and politics across Europe. Such power rarely goes unchallenged forever. Kings began to ask questions, not publicly at first, but in private chambers. Why should an order of monks control so much wealth? Why should they answer to no crown? Why should their fortresses stand within royal cities, immune to royal law? These were not theological questions. They were political ones. And political questions, once asked, demand answers. The Templars had learned how to rule without ruling, how to command without commanding. It was an art perfected over generations. But the very subtlety of their dominance made it difficult to defend when fear replaced trust. When the moment came, it would not arrive as a battle, but as an accusation. Not as a siege, but as a legal maneuver. The order that had mastered systems would be attacked through systems. And those who understood power best would recognize the danger first. By the time the trap was sprung, the Knights Templar were no longer just warriors of faith. They were a structure, interconnected, disciplined, and resilient. A structure that, once threatened, might do the one thing it had always done better than anyone else: adapt. When most people imagine the Knights Templar, they see armored horsemen charging across dusty battlefields, red crosses blazing against white cloaks. The sea rarely enters that image. Yet for an order whose lifeblood was movement, of men, money, and messages, the water was not a boundary but a highway. Long before their downfall, the Templars had learned that whoever controlled the sea controlled survival itself. From the earliest years of the Crusades, reaching the Holy Land depended on ships. Overland routes were slow, dangerous, and unpredictable. Armies starved. Pilgrims vanished. Supplies rotted before arrival. The Mediterranean, for all its dangers, offered speed and scale. The Templars understood this quickly, and while their naval power never carried the same romantic image as their cavalry, it was just as essential. They did not build a navy overnight. At first, they relied on allied fleets, Italian city-states like Genoa, Pisa, and Venice. But reliance breeds vulnerability. Political alliances shifted. Contracts broke. Prices rose. Gradually, the Templars began securing their own maritime infrastructure. Ports, warehouses, docks, and eventually ships of their own. Across Europe's coastline, Templar harbors emerged as quiet but efficient hubs. From the Atlantic ports of France to the Mediterranean shores of Italy and the Iberian Peninsula, these sites served as logistical arteries. Grain from England could be shipped to Provence. Weapons forged inland could reach the Levant. Gold collected in Paris could move discreetly across borders and seas. Among these ports, La Rochelle stood apart. Situated on the Atlantic coast, it was perfectly positioned for long-distance travel. Unlike the Mediterranean, the Atlantic was less crowded, less regulated, and far more unpredictable. It required experienced sailors, sturdy ships, and deep knowledge of tides and winds. The Templars invested in all three. Their ships were not designed for glory. They were built for endurance. Broad-hulled vessels capable of carrying cargo, horses, and men. Crews were drawn from coastal communities, sworn to secrecy and rewarded with steady employment. These sailors were not monks, but they operated under Templar discipline. Orders were followed. Questions were not asked. Maritime operations demanded trust even more than land campaigns. A ship at sea was isolated, beyond immediate oversight. The Templars addressed this by selecting captains carefully and structuring incentives to ensure loyalty. Payment, protection, and a reputation for fairness bound men to the order more securely than fear alone ever could. The sea also offered something land could not: plausible deniability. A ship delayed by storms raised no suspicion. A vessel lost at sea left no witnesses. Cargo could be diverted, transferred, or hidden far from prying eyes. For an order that valued discretion, the ocean was an ideal partner. Over time, the Templars became adept at moving sensitive materials by water. Not all cargo was recorded in detail. Some shipments were known only to a handful of senior figures. This was not necessarily sinister. It was practical. In a world of spies and rival interests, secrecy was protection. Ports like La Rochelle were fortified not just with walls, but with layers of administration. Warehouses were compartmentalized. Ledgers were separated. Access was restricted. A visitor might see ordinary trade goods, wine, wool, grain, while never glimpsing what lay deeper within the complex. The order had learned that the most effective concealment is normality. Their maritime reach extended beyond Europe. Ships sailed regularly to the eastern Mediterranean, supplying remaining Crusader strongholds even as the political situation deteriorated. When Acre fell in 1291, it was Templar vessels that evacuated survivors, relics, and records under fire. That experience left a deep mark on the order. They had seen what sudden collapse looked like. They had practiced escape under pressure. The loss of the Holy Land forced a strategic shift. With no permanent base in the east, the Templars consolidated in Europe. Their ships now served different purposes: maintaining communication between commanderies, transporting funds, and reinforcing coastal defenses. But they also offered something else: options. The Atlantic, in particular, presented possibilities that few had fully explored. Beyond familiar coasts lay uncertainty, but also opportunity. Fishing expeditions had already ventured far north and west. Sailors spoke of strange currents, distant lands, and routes that avoided hostile territories altogether. Whether the Templars believed these stories or merely filed them away is unknown. What is certain is that they listened. By the early 14th century, the order possessed a network of ports capable of rapid coordination. Messages could travel faster by sea than by road. Ships could be readied quietly, away from the scrutiny of royal courts. Supplies could be stockpiled without attracting attention, disguised as routine commerce. This capability matters because it changes how we interpret what happened in 1307. An order without ships might be caught completely off guard by a sudden arrest. An order with maritime infrastructure had choices. The disappearance of Templar ships from key ports on the eve of the arrest suggests preparation, not panic. These were not desperate men fleeing blindly. This was an organization executing a contingency plan. Ships do not load themselves. Crews do not assemble by accident. Routes are not chosen in haste. Someone gave the order. Someone decided what to take and what to leave behind. It is tempting to imagine holds filled with gold and silver, but such cargo would have been difficult to conceal and easy to trace. More plausible are items of lower immediate value but higher long-term significance. Documents, charters, financial records, symbols of authority, and perhaps a small number of individuals whose survival mattered more than wealth. The Templars had always thought in terms of continuity. Fortresses fell. Battles were lost. But the order endured by preserving its structure and knowledge. Ships offered a way to carry that structure intact, beyond the reach of hostile powers. After the arrests, royal investigators scoured Templar properties, cataloging what remained. They found wealth, yes, but far less than expected. Accounts did not balance. Assets were missing. The official explanation blamed mismanagement or exaggeration. The simpler explanation was that what truly mattered was no longer there. And yet, official records say little about the maritime side of this operation. Ports are mentioned only briefly. Missing ships are noted without commentary. It is as if no one wanted to linger on the implications. To admit that the Templars had slipped away by sea was to admit failure. The ocean absorbed the evidence. Without wrecks or survivors to interrogate, speculation faded into rumor. Over time, the naval dimension of the Templar story became footnote rather than focus. Horsemen are easier to mythologize than sailors. But if we follow the logic of the order, its emphasis on logistics, foresight, and adaptability, the sea was always going to play a decisive role in its final chapter. The Templars did not trust in miracles. They trusted in preparation. When the knock came at the door, they did not reach for swords. Somewhere, perhaps days or weeks earlier, they had reached for sails. And once a ship clears the harbor and the coastline disappears into the horizon, history's grip weakens. Records end. Certainty dissolves. What remains is possibility. The Templars understood that better than most. For them, the sea was not an escape route born of desperation. It was the last, quiet extension of a system they had been building for generations. And when the order vanished from land, it was the ocean that closed behind it, leaving only an empty harbor, and questions no king could answer. King Philip IV of France did not wake one morning and decide to destroy the Knights Templar. The decision grew slowly, fed by years of frustration, financial strain, and wounded pride. To understand why the most powerful monarch in Western Europe turned against an order that had served Christendom for 2 centuries, one must first understand the man himself, and the world pressing in around him. Philip was born into kingship at a time when the idea of royal authority was changing. He believed deeply in the supremacy of the crown, not just as a political institution but as a moral one. France, in his vision, was not a loose collection of feudal loyalties but a centralized state with the king at its heart. Anything that rivaled that authority, even indirectly, was a threat. His reign was marked by conflict from the beginning. Wars against England drained the treasury. Territorial ambitions in Flanders proved costly and humiliating. Maintaining a large court and a professional bureaucracy required money on a scale medieval kings rarely possessed. Traditional sources of income, taxes, feudal dues, and coinage were no longer enough. So Philip borrowed. He borrowed heavily. The Knights Templar, with their vast resources and efficient financial network, were the natural choice. They were trusted. They were organized. They were, in theory, incorruptible. Over time, the French crown became deeply indebted to the order. Royal revenues passed through Templar hands. The king's treasure was stored in the Templar fortress in Paris. This arrangement was practical, but it carried an unspoken humiliation. The King of France relied on an institution he did not control. At first, Philip tolerated this dependence. Then he resented it. Financial pressure sharpened that resentment into hostility. When the crown's debts mounted, the Templars did not forgive them. They were administrators, not patrons. Accounts were kept. Obligations recorded. This inflexibility, admirable in theory, became unbearable to a ruler accustomed to bending systems to his will. Philip's frustration was compounded by his conflicts with the Church. His struggle with Pope Boniface VIII over taxation and authority had already tested the limits of royal power. When Boniface died under suspicious circumstances following Philip's pressure, the message was clear. The King of France could challenge even the papacy. But the papacy itself remained an obstacle. The Templars answered directly to the Pope. As long as that protection stood, they were beyond Philip's reach. To strike them, he would need not only political justification but moral legitimacy. That legitimacy came in the form of accusation. Rumors about the Templars had circulated for years, whispers of strange initiation rites, of secret oaths, of irreverence toward sacred symbols. Most had been dismissed as envy or ignorance. Philip, however, understood their potential. In a deeply religious society, the charge of heresy was more powerful than any army. Carefully, quietly, the king began to gather testimonies. Some came from disgruntled former members. Others from criminals promised leniency. The truth of these claims mattered less than their plausibility. Once spoken aloud, they took on a life of their own. Philip's legal mind shaped the attack. He did not frame it as a seizure of wealth, though wealth would follow. He framed it as a defense of the faith. This positioning forced the church into a corner. To defend the Templars outright was to appear soft on heresy. To hesitate was to invite suspicion. Pope Clement V, newly elected and politically vulnerable, found himself under immense pressure. He was French, beholden in many ways to Philip, and eager to avoid open conflict. The king presented the allegations as urgent and credible. Delay, he argued, would endanger souls. What Philip did not reveal was the scale of his planning. The arrests were coordinated across the kingdom, executed with military precision. Sealed orders ensured secrecy. Even many officials carrying them did not know their contents until the moment of action. This was not a reaction. It was a calculated strike. Behind the religious language lay a cold arithmetic. By destroying the order, Philip could erase his debts, seize its assets, and eliminate a rival source of authority. It was a solution that addressed multiple problems at once. Yet it was not without risk. The Templars were respected. They had allies. A misstep could provoke backlash from other nobles or even foreign powers. Philip mitigated this risk by acting decisively and framing the narrative before opposition could form. Shock became his greatest weapon. On the morning of the arrests, the order was stunned. Its leadership was captured. Its communications disrupted. But the king's control was not absolute. As events at the ports would later suggest, not everything went according to plan. The fact that ships escaped complicates the image of Philip as an omnipotent strategist. It suggests limits to his reach or cracks in his secrecy. Perhaps someone within his court sympathized with the order. Perhaps the Templars themselves had anticipated betrayal long before Philip acted. Either way, the king's victory was incomplete. In the months that followed, Philip pushed relentlessly for condemnation. He leaned on the Pope, orchestrated public trials, and ensured that confessions, extracted under torture, were widely circulated. The image of the Templars shifted rapidly from holy warriors to corrupt heretics. Public opinion, guided carefully, turned against them. Yet even as he tightened his grip, Philip faced resistance. Not all rulers followed his lead. In some regions, arrests were delayed or softened. The Pope hesitated, launching investigations rather than immediate dissolution. This hesitation enraged Philip, who saw any delay as a threat to his plan. His persistence paid off, but at a cost. The trials dragged on. Evidence remained contradictory. Some Templars recanted their confessions, proclaiming their innocence even under threat of death. These moments of defiance undermined the king's narrative, but not enough to stop it. When Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, was burned at the stake, Philip believed the matter settled. The order was dissolved, its wealth redistributed, its name stained beyond repair. And yet, history has not been kind to Philip's legacy in this matter. The speed and severity of his actions have raised questions for centuries. Was he defending the faith or exploiting it? Was he a pious ruler or a debtor eliminating his creditors? Perhaps he was both. What remains undeniable is that Philip underestimated the Templars in one crucial way. He saw them as an institution rooted in land, wealth, and hierarchy. He did not fully account for their adaptability, their ability to act beyond borders, their willingness to abandon visible power to preserve something less tangible. The king won the trial. He won the assets. He won the narrative of his time. But as ships slipped into the night and the sea erased their wake, it became clear that victory on paper does not always translate to control in reality. Philip destroyed the order as it was known. Whether he destroyed what it represented is a question that history still struggles to answer. The morning of October 13, 1307 did not arrive with thunder or warning. It came softly, almost gently, as if the world itself wished to hide what was about to happen. In Paris, the sky was pale and cold, the streets still quiet, the city unaware that by nightfall one of the most powerful institutions in Europe would be broken beyond recognition. The date would later become infamous, but in those first moments it was simply another Friday. Across the Kingdom of France, royal officials carried sealed orders stamped with the king's authority. They had been instructed not to open them until a specific hour, and most obeyed without question. The secrecy was absolute. Even seasoned administrators had no idea what they were about to unleash. This was intentional. King Philip understood that information was dangerous. The fewer who knew, the less likely the plan would unravel. When the seals were finally broken, confusion spread quickly. The orders were stark, uncompromising, and precise. Every member of the Knights Templar was to be arrested, their property seized, their papers secured. No explanation offered, no mercy granted. The accusations were severe: heresy, idolatry, corruption of sacred rites. But the instructions allowed no debate. Action was required immediately. Soldiers moved through the streets with torches and chains. They knocked on heavy wooden doors and forced entry where resistance was offered. Templar commanderies, places usually associated with discipline and prayer, filled with chaos. Knights were dragged from their beds, some still half asleep, others already kneeling in confusion. A few resisted instinctively, only to be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Most did not fight. They seemed stunned, as if the idea of such betrayal was impossible to process. There were no pitched battles, no heroic last stands. That absence would later trouble historians. The Templars were trained warriors. Many had faced death repeatedly in the East. Yet here, in the heart of Christian Europe, they allowed themselves to be bound and led away. Some whispered prayers. Others stared silently at the men arresting them, searching for an explanation that never came. In Paris, Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Order, was taken without resistance. He had been in the city for weeks, attending royal business and participating in ceremonies. There was no sign that he expected arrest. Or perhaps there was, and he simply chose not to flee. His capture sent a clear message. This was not a local dispute. This was the end of something. By mid-morning, the arrests were complete. Hundreds of Templars were imprisoned across the kingdom. The speed of the operation was staggering. King Philip had achieved what few rulers ever managed, neutralizing a powerful organization in a single day. And yet, cracks appeared almost immediately. At several coastal towns, royal officials arrived to find their targets missing. Not individuals, but infrastructure. Ships that should have been at anchor were gone. Warehouses stood partially empty. Dockworkers claimed ignorance. Some said the vessels had sailed days earlier. Others insisted they had left during the night. No one could offer a clear answer. This was deeply unsettling. The king's orders had been designed to allow no escape. The fact that something had slipped through suggested either incompetence or betrayal. Neither possibility was acceptable. The timing raised even more troubling questions. The Templars had not reacted in panic. Ships require preparation. Crews must be assembled. Cargo selected. Routes planned. This had not been a spontaneous flight. It had the unmistakable signs of foresight. Someone had known. Whether the warning came from within the royal court, the papal circle, or the order itself remains unknown. Perhaps the secrecy had not been as complete as Philip believed. Or perhaps the Templars had long suspected that such a moment would come. The hostility had been growing for years. The accusations circulating through Europe were not new. A cautious organization might reasonably prepare for the worst. What complicates the story is the behavior of those arrested. Under interrogation, few mentioned any attempt to flee. They did not boast of secret plans or hidden allies. They spoke as if resignation, not resistance, had been expected. This silence could be interpreted as shock, could also be interpreted as discipline. As the days passed, the accusations grew darker. Prisoners were interrogated relentlessly. Torture extracted confessions that shocked the public. Denials of Christ, spitting on the cross, secret rites conducted in darkness. These stories spread quickly, painting the order as monstrous. Fear replaced sympathy. The narrative shifted. But even as the spectacle unfolded, the missing ships remained an unresolved anomaly. If the Templars were guilty of such crimes, why escape? And if they were innocent, why not defend themselves openly? The contradiction was never addressed directly. It lingered at the edges of official records, quietly undermining certainty. For King Philip, the priority was control. The arrests had achieved their immediate goal, but the escape of ships represented unfinished business. Investigations were ordered. Port officials were questioned. But without physical evidence, little could be done. The sea had erased the trail. The Pope, watching events unfold, grew uneasy. He had not authorized the arrests. Philip had acted first, forcing Rome to respond. Clement V called for inquiries, attempting to reassert ecclesiastical authority. But the momentum favored the king. Public outrage, fueled by lurid accusations, made hesitation dangerous. In this charged atmosphere, nuance vanished. The Templars were no longer individuals with histories and service records. They were a single, condemned entity. Their silence was interpreted as guilt. Their discipline, once admired, was now seen as proof of conspiracy. And yet, beneath the surface, a strange imbalance persisted. The order had collapsed on land with stunning speed, but at sea it had slipped away almost effortlessly. The contrast was too stark to ignore. Some contemporaries noticed. Chroniclers recorded the arrests in detail but mentioned the ships only briefly, as if uncertain how to integrate the fact. It did not fit the narrative of total victory, and so it was minimized. For the men in chains, the future was grim. Years of imprisonment awaited many. Trials dragged on. Some recanted confessions, declaring their innocence even when it meant death. Others broke completely, their voices reduced to whispers that barely reached the page. Meanwhile, wherever the missing ships had gone, they did not return. No demands were made. No proclamations issued. There was no dramatic counterstroke. Just absence. That absence is what makes this day so haunting. The arrests were meant to be absolute, a clean erasure of an order deemed dangerous. Instead, they revealed a failure small in appearance but profound in implication. The king had struck with overwhelming force. The church would eventually comply. The order would be dissolved. And yet, something essential had slipped beyond reach. Friday the 13th entered history as a symbol of misfortune, betrayal, and fear. But for the Knights Templar, it was something else entirely. It was the moment when their visible power ended, and their invisible story began. What happened next would not be written in court records or papal decrees. It would be carried by rumor, by symbol, and by the quiet knowledge that not everything the king sought to destroy had been captured. The arrests ended the order's public life. The unanswered questions ensured it would never truly disappear. La Rochelle should have been busy that morning. As one of the most important ports on the Atlantic coast of France, it rarely slept. Fishermen rose before dawn. Merchants oversaw the loading of cargo, and sailors moved through the mist with practiced ease. But in the days following the arrests of the Knights Templar, something was wrong. The harbor was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if sound itself had been muted. Royal officials arrived expecting resistance, confusion, perhaps even violence. Instead, they found emptiness. The Templar quarter of the port stood intact, its buildings unburned, its docks undamaged. There were no signs of battle, no hurried destruction, no abandoned tools. Everything looked orderly, too orderly, and the ships that should have been tied to the quays were not there. Chroniclers later recorded the fact almost casually, as if unsure what to make of it. The Templars had maintained a significant fleet at La Rochelle, vessels used to transport men, supplies, and funds along the Atlantic routes. How many ships were missing remains uncertain. Estimates vary, and records are frustratingly vague. But all accounts agree on one point. Several Templar ships vanished at precisely the moment they should have been seized. The king's men questioned dockworkers, sailors, and local merchants. Most claimed ignorance. Some insisted the ships had departed days earlier on routine business. Others said they had slipped out under cover of darkness. No one could provide a destination. No cargo manifests explained the absence. It was as if the ships had never existed. This absence was more troubling than open defiance would have been. A battle could be explained. A revolt could be crushed. But disappearance suggested foresight. It suggested that the Templars had not been caught unaware. And that raised a dangerous possibility. The Order had known what was coming. La Rochelle was not just any port. It was a hub of Templar maritime operations, uniquely positioned for Atlantic travel. Unlike Mediterranean routes, which were crowded and closely watched, the Atlantic offered space, anonymity, and uncertainty. Ships could sail north toward the British Isles or south toward Iberia. They could hug the coast or strike out into deeper waters. Tracking them was nearly impossible. The Templars had chosen La Rochelle for a reason. Its deep harbor, strong fortifications, and relative independence from direct royal oversight made it ideal for discreet movement. Over the years, the Order had invested heavily in its infrastructure. Warehouses lined the docks. Administrative buildings controlled access. Everything was designed to function efficiently, quietly, and without attracting unnecessary attention. The missing ships suggested that this system had been activated deliberately. This was not a panicked flight by frightened men. It was a controlled withdrawal. Cargo had been selected, not hastily thrown aboard. Crews had been assembled, not conscripted. The absence of chaos indicated planning. What, then, had been taken? Royal inventories of Templar property seized elsewhere provide some clues by omission. While the Order was known to be wealthy, the assets recovered did not match expectations. Some funds were found, yes, but not on the scale rumored. Certain records were missing. Certain relics were unaccounted for. The discrepancy was never fully explained. It is tempting to imagine chests of gold stacked in the holds of the vanished ships, but gold is heavy and conspicuous. Moving it would have required time and risk. More likely were items of a different nature. Documents detailing financial networks, correspondence between commanderies, symbols of authority, or knowledge accumulated over generations. The Templars understood the value of information. Their power lay not only in what they owned, but in what they knew, who owed whom, which routes were safe, which alliances held firm. Such knowledge, preserved, could allow an organization to survive even after its physical structures were destroyed. La Rochelle's silence deepened the mystery. The city itself did not rise in protest. There was no recorded outrage, no mass attempt to defend the Templars. Life continued, outwardly unchanged. This suggests that whatever happened at the port was meant to go unnoticed. And largely it did. The royal administration, focused on securing confessions and assets inland, did not pursue the matter aggressively. Perhaps the king feared what further investigation might reveal. Or perhaps the absence of tangible evidence made it easier to let the question fade. Yet the implications lingered. If the Templars had escaped by sea, where had they gone? Portugal, with its sympathetic rulers, was a possibility. Scotland, at odds with both England and the papacy, was another. The Atlantic itself opened further options. Routes less traveled. Lands less known. What complicates the picture is the lack of any clear follow-up. No Templar fleet appeared elsewhere, announcing survival or demanding justice. No dramatic return was recorded. Instead, Fragments surfaced quietly over time. Rebranded orders, familiar faces appearing in unexpected places, systems that resembled Templar practices emerging under new names. La Rochelle thus became a symbol rather than a location. It represented a moment when control slipped, when an order that seemed cornered demonstrated its ability to vanish. The harbor's emptiness spoke louder than any confession extracted under torture. For later generations, the mystery of La Rochelle would inspire speculation. Treasure hunters, historians, and storytellers would all return to that silent port, asking the same questions. How many ships? Who was aboard? What was carried away? But perhaps the most unsettling question is the simplest one. Why did no one pursue them? In an age obsessed with authority and punishment, the failure to chase the vanished fleet feels deliberate, as if acknowledging the escape would undermine the narrative of total victory. Better to let the sea keep its secrets than to admit that the king's reach had limits. The docks of La Rochelle eventually filled again with new ships, new cargo, new routines. The moment passed. The wood rotted. The names were forgotten. But the gap remained, an absence embedded in the historical record. An absence has a strange power. It invites imagination. It resists closure. It whispers that the story is incomplete. The Templars left no message behind. No declaration. No challenge. Just an empty harbor and a question that refuses to fade. Whatever departed La Rochelle did so quietly, without spectacle, trusting the sea to erase its trail. Centuries later, that trust still holds. The water reveals nothing, and the silence of that port continues to echo, reminding us that the greatest escapes are often the ones no one notices until it is far too late. Once the shock of the arrests faded and the silence of the empty harbors settled into rumor, attention turned naturally to a single, irresistible question. What did the Templars take with them? For centuries, this question has been answered too quickly and too simply. Gold. Treasure. Chests of silver hauled into the night. The image is powerful, but it may be misleading. To understand what was truly worth saving, one must step into the mindset of an order that had survived wars, defeats, and political reversals by thinking far beyond immediate wealth. The Templars were not reckless hoarders of gold. Their finances were meticulously structured, distributed across commanderies, and recorded in ledgers that balanced risk and access. Large sums were rarely kept in one place unless necessary. Concentrating wealth invited disaster. This was an organization built to endure loss, not gamble everything on secrecy. If gold had been their priority, much of it could have been seized anyway. Royal inventories show that considerable assets were captured after the arrests. This alone suggests that material wealth was not the primary focus of any escape. What mattered more were things that could not easily be replaced. One such category was documentation. The Templars managed an international financial network long before the concept existed in name. They held records of debts owed by nobles and kings, agreements between rival factions, and deposits entrusted to them for safekeeping. These documents represented leverage. In the wrong hands, they could destabilize entire regions. In the right hands, they could rebuild influence from nothing. Beyond financial records lay correspondence. Letters exchanged between commanderies, coded instructions, and reports from the East. These papers mapped the inner workings of the order. They revealed how decisions were made, how resources flowed, and where loyalties lay. Preserving this information meant preserving the order's institutional memory. Then there were relics. Medieval Europe placed enormous spiritual value on physical objects believed to carry divine power or historical significance. The Templars were known to have acquired such items during their long presence in the Holy Land. Some were public, displayed to inspire devotion. Others were kept private, their significance known only to a few. Whether these relics were fragments of saints, objects associated with Christ, or symbolic artifacts tied to the order's identity is impossible to say with certainty. What matters is that relics were more than devotional tools. They conferred legitimacy. Possession of a revered object could attract followers, donations, and protection. There is also the possibility of knowledge that existed outside physical form. Rituals, teachings, navigational expertise, and administrative practices lived in the minds of senior members. Saving the right people could matter more than saving any object. A handful of experienced leaders, if preserved, could recreate the order systems elsewhere under a different name. This idea challenges the popular image of a treasure-laden escape. It suggests something quieter, more deliberate, a selection process, choices made under pressure about what would matter 10 years or 50 years or a century later. The Templars had faced catastrophe before. The fall of Jerusalem, the loss of Acre, these were traumatic events that forced rapid evacuation and reorganization. They learned hard lessons about what could be replaced and what could not. Buildings could be rebuilt. Money could be earned again. But trust, knowledge, and continuity were fragile. That experience shaped their priorities. There is also the matter of symbolism. The Templars were deeply aware of how symbols sustained identity. Their seals, their charters, their internal codes, these were not merely administrative tools but anchors of belonging. To preserve them was to preserve the idea of the order itself. Some historians argue that the ships carried nothing extraordinary, that the mystery has been inflated by later imagination. But this view struggles to explain the careful timing and coordination of the departures. If nothing of value was at stake, why take the risk at all? Why not surrender everything and rely on the Church to clear their name? The answer may lie in a loss of faith, not in God, but in institutions. By 1307, the Templars had reason to distrust both crown and papacy. Political pressure had corrupted spiritual authority before. Confessions extracted under torture were already a known tactic. The order may have recognized that justice would not prevail. In that context, saving something beyond reach was not an act of greed, but of survival. Another possibility often overlooked is that the ships carried people whose identities needed to disappear. Men who knew too much. Men whose survival could endanger others. Removing them from the historical record would protect both them and the order's future. Disappearance is a powerful tool. A man who vanishes cannot be interrogated. His testimony cannot be twisted. His silence cannot be broken. The sea offers this kind of erasure more effectively than any prison. Over time, legends filled the gaps. Stories of sacred grails, secret gospels, and forbidden wisdom attached themselves to the missing ships. These tales say more about human longing than historical evidence. Yet they persist because they gesture toward a deeper truth, the sense that something essential was removed before destruction fell. Perhaps the greatest mistake is assuming that the Templars thought in terms of endings. Their entire history had been one of adaptation. They did not see the arrests as a final chapter, but as a transformation. What they saved would need to support that transformation. If that is true, then the real treasure was not material at all. It was the capacity to reappear in altered form, to influence events without being named, to survive without being seen. In this light, the missing ships become less about loss and more about continuity. They carried forward a structure, not a fortune, a method, not a monument. This perspective also explains the absence of dramatic revelations afterward. If the goal was survival, not vindication, then silence was success. Drawing attention would only invite renewed persecution. Centuries later, the frustration remains. Treasure hunters dig. Scholars debate. Stories multiply. But no definitive hoard emerges. No undeniable relic surfaces. Instead, patterns appear, echoes of Templar organization in later institutions, familiar financial practices, familiar symbols resurfacing in unexpected places. These echoes suggest that whatever was saved fulfilled its purpose. It allowed something to endure without exposing itself. That endurance, quiet and unclaimed, may be the most valuable thing the Templars ever possessed. The ships that vanished did not need to carry gold to be priceless. They carried the means to continue, and in a world determined to erase them, that was worth more than any treasure that could ever be weighed or counted. When the first confessions emerged, they spread like fire through dry grass. Stories of secret rituals, forbidden kisses, and renunciations of Christ shocked a society that still measured truth by faith. To many observers, These admissions seemed to confirm the worst fears whispered about the Knights Templar. Yet beneath the surface something felt wrong. The words sounded rehearsed, the details repeated with unsettling consistency, and the circumstances under which they were given cast a long shadow over their credibility. The men who confessed did so in chains, isolated from one another, interrogated by officials acting under royal pressure. Torture was not an exception in these proceedings. It was a method. Medieval law accepted pain as a path to truth, but it also produced predictable results. Under enough suffering, a man will say almost anything. The Templars were no different. What stands out in the records is not what the confessions claim, but how they claim it. Phrases recur. Descriptions align too neatly. The same alleged actions appear in testimonies taken hundreds of miles apart. This uniformity suggests guidance, not spontaneous recollection. It is as if the interrogators already knew the answers they wanted, and the prisoners learned quickly what those answers were. Many Templars initially denied all charges. Only after prolonged torture did they begin to confess. Even then, the confessions often contradicted one another in detail while agreeing in outline. One man described a ritual involving a cross. Another mentioned a cat. Another spoke vaguely of secret words spoken in darkness. The common thread was not coherence, but compliance. More revealing still are the moments when the pressure eased. In hearings conducted without torture, confessions became rare. Men spoke more cautiously. Some recanted entirely, insisting that their earlier statements had been lies told to end the pain. These recantations were often ignored or punished, reinforcing the sense that the process was less about discovering truth and more about producing justification. The political usefulness of these confessions cannot be overstated. They transformed the narrative from one of financial and institutional conflict into a moral crusade. A king acting against creditors could be criticized. A king acting against heresy became a defender of the faith. The confessions provided cover. But there is another layer to consider. The content of the accusations, however exaggerated, focused almost exclusively on internal rituals and beliefs. They said little about finances, logistics, or external alliances. This is curious. If the goal had been a full exposure of the order's operations, one would expect questions about money, ships, and communications. Instead, the spotlight remained fixed on theology. This narrow focus may have served a second purpose: distraction. While interrogators obsessed over imagined blasphemies, more practical matters slipped into the background. Missing assets were attributed to corruption or exaggeration. The vanished ships received little attention. The confessions created such a moral spectacle that administrative gaps were barely noticed. In this sense, the Templars' behavior under interrogation takes on a different light. Their willingness to confess to outrageous sins while remaining silent on logistical matters may not have been accidental. A man under torture cannot protect everything. He chooses, consciously or not, what to sacrifice. By confessing to crimes that could not be proven independently, the Templars fed the narrative without exposing what could still be used against others. A blasphemous ritual harmed only their reputation. Revealing names, routes, or plans could endanger lives and destroy any hope of continuity. This interpretation is uncomfortable, but it aligns with the order's culture of obedience and sacrifice. Individuals were taught to place the survival of the whole above their own honor. If absorbing disgrace protected something greater, it would have been considered a worthy trade. Not all Templars complied. Some resisted until the end. Some recanted publicly, declaring their innocence even as the flames rose. These moments disrupted the king's narrative, but they were not enough to stop it. The machinery of condemnation had already begun to turn. The Pope's response further complicates the picture. Clement V ordered investigations that acknowledged the dubious nature of the confessions. He recognized the role of torture, yet he also faced immense pressure to act decisively. His eventual compromise, dissolving the order without declaring it heretical, suggests uncertainty. He ended the institution while leaving its guilt unresolved. This ambiguity is telling. If the evidence had been clear, a formal condemnation would have followed. Instead, the Church chose expediency over clarity. The confessions had served their purpose. The deeper questions could be left unanswered. From a psychological perspective, the uniformity of the confessions may also reflect trauma. Men subjected to extreme stress often cling to scripts provided by authority figures. Repeating expected answers becomes a coping mechanism. The mind seeks patterns when chaos overwhelms it. Yet even trauma cannot fully explain the strategic silence around certain topics. Ships, finances, and escape routes rarely appear in testimony. It is as if an unspoken line existed, one that could not be crossed, regardless of pain. This silence would later frustrate historians. The trial records are extensive, but they illuminate the wrong things. They reveal fear, suffering, and manipulation, but not the practical realities of what the order did in its final days. The confessions also shaped public memory. For generations, the image of the Templars as heretics overshadowed their historical role. This distortion served the interests of those who benefited from their downfall. It also discouraged deeper inquiry. Few questioned the narrative once it was sanctified by repetition. And yet, the cracks remain visible. The contradictions, the recantations, the Pope's hesitation, the missing ships. Together, they suggest that the confessions were not the full story, but a performance, one that concealed as much as it revealed. If the Templars did orchestrate an escape of people or knowledge, then maintaining silence under torture would have been essential. Loose words could unravel everything. In that light, the confessions become a shield. A grotesque one, but effective. By the time the trials concluded, the order was broken. Its name was tarnished. Its members were scattered, imprisoned, or dead. The king had what he wanted. The Church had avoided open conflict. The public had its explanation. But explanations that rely on pain and repetition rarely endure without question. What lingers instead is the sense that the confessions tell us more about the machinery of power than about the men who spoke them. They reveal how truth can be shaped, how narratives can be engineered, and how silence can be as deliberate as speech. In the end, the most consistent testimony of all may be what was never said. When news of the arrests reached Pope Clement V, it did not arrive as a proclamation of justice, but as a shock. The King of France had acted without papal authorization, seizing an order that answered directly to Rome. In theory, this was an open challenge to papal authority. In practice, it revealed how fragile that authority had become. Clement V was not a strong pope by temperament, nor was his position secure. Elected after a bitter conclave, he owed his tiara in part to French influence. He resided not in Rome but in the orbit of the French crown, a reality that limited his freedom of action. Every decision he made was weighed against political consequence. Faced with Philip's accusations, Clement hesitated, not because he trusted the Templars blindly, but because the charges were extraordinary. An order founded with papal blessing, protected for generations, and praised for its service was now accused of systematic heresy. If true, it would represent a catastrophic failure of the Church itself. If false, it would expose a king's abuse of power. Clement requested evidence. What he received were confessions, numerous, detailed, and deeply disturbing. But he also knew how they had been obtained. Torture was common in secular courts, but the Church viewed it with suspicion, especially in cases involving clerics. The Pope understood that pain could manufacture guilt as easily as uncover it. Rather than endorse the king's actions outright, Clement attempted to slow the process. He called for formal inquiries, insisting that the Church must judge its own. This delay infuriated Philip. To the king, hesitation threatened the narrative he had constructed. Doubt could unravel everything. Behind closed doors, pressure mounted. The French crown controlled not only territory, but access. Clement's court depended on royal cooperation for security and resources. Resistance carried risks that went far beyond theology. Still, Clement did not immediately yield. His correspondence reveals uncertainty, even concern. He questioned inconsistencies in the testimonies. He ordered that Templars in other regions be treated cautiously. In some places, this caution saved lives, at least temporarily. Yet the Pope's caution was a double-edged sword. By neither condemning nor exonerating the order, he allowed events to proceed without clear guidance. Local rulers interpreted his silence according to their interests. Some arrested Templars swiftly, others delayed. The result was fragmentation, a patchwork of responses that further muddied the historical record. Clement's greatest fear was schism. A direct confrontation with the French crown could split the Church at a time when unity was already fragile. The memory of recent papal humiliations was fresh. Clement knew how far Philip was willing to go. In 1308, Clement took a dramatic step. He suspended the order across Christendom, asserting papal control while stopping short of declaring it heretical. This was a compromise. It placated the king while preserving a sliver of ecclesiastical authority. But it also sealed the Templars' fate in practice. Without papal support, they were defenseless. Throughout this period, Clement's hesitation continued to puzzle observers. Why did he not act decisively one way or the other? One explanation lies in the absence of clear evidence. Another lies in politics. But there is a third, more unsettling possibility. The Pope suspected that something had already slipped beyond his grasp. Reports of missing assets and vanished ships would have reached Rome, at least indirectly. Clement may have realized that whatever the Templars had possessed was no longer fully available to judge or seize. Condemning the order might resolve the immediate crisis, but it would not restore control. By dissolving the order without pronouncing its guilt, Clement chose a path of least resistance. He ended the controversy rather than resolving it. In doing so, he preserved the Church's outward unity at the cost of historical clarity. This decision haunted him. The Council of Vienne in 1312 formalized the dissolution, but even there, Clement avoided declaring the Templars heretics. He spoke instead of scandal, confusion, and the need for peace. It was an admission that certainty was unattainable. For the surviving Templars, this ambiguity was devastating. They were stripped of identity without vindication. For historians, it remains a crucial clue. Institutions confident of guilt do not hesitate so publicly. Clement's behavior also reveals the limits of papal power in the early 14th century. The Pope could no longer impose his will on kings with impunity. The balance had shifted. Secular authority, backed by force and finance, now rivaled spiritual authority. In this context, the Templars were collateral damage. Their unique position, answering only to the Pope, made them a test case. Their fall signaled a broader transformation in European power structures. Clement's hesitation thus becomes symbolic. It marks the moment when the papacy recognized its vulnerability. The Templars were sacrificed to maintain a fragile equilibrium. Yet the Pope's reluctance also left space for survival. By refusing to define the order as heretical, Clement ensured that its members were not automatically damned. In some regions, this allowed former Templars to be absorbed into new institutions, their skills preserved under different names. Whether this outcome was intentional or accidental remains debated. Clement may have hoped to protect individuals even as he dismantled the institution. Or he may have simply been overwhelmed by forces beyond his control. In either case, his hesitation had lasting consequences. Prevented a clean ending. It left questions unanswered. It ensured that the story of the Templars would remain contested. When Clement died in 1314, the same year as Jacques de Molay, the matter was officially closed. But closure achieved through compromise rarely satisfies. The silence left behind invites speculation. The Pope who hesitated did not save the order. But he also did not destroy it entirely. In the gaps created by his uncertainty, possibilities survived. And in history, it is often those gaps, not the declarations, that endure longest. Once the arrests were complete and the shock began to settle, a quieter, more troubling realization emerged among those paying close attention. If the Templar ships had truly vanished, then they must have gone somewhere. Ships do not dissolve into water. They follow routes. They obey winds, currents, and human intention. The mystery was no longer only about disappearance, but direction. Medieval Europe did not possess modern navigation, but it was far from ignorant of the sea. Sailors knew the rhythms of tides, the behavior of seasonal winds, and the dangers of certain coasts. Trade routes had been established for generations, connecting ports in predictable patterns. Any ship leaving La Rochelle would have faced a limited number of realistic options, each carrying its own risks and implications. One possibility was the simplest: south along the coast toward the Iberian Peninsula. Portugal, in particular, stands out. The Portuguese crown had long maintained a cooperative relationship with the Templars. Unlike France, Portugal did not view the order as a rival threat. Its rulers valued the Templars' military experience and administrative skill, especially along contested borders with Muslim territories. Sailing south from La Rochelle was practical. The coastline provided shelter. Friendly ports offered resupply. The journey required no extraordinary risk. If the ships carried people or sensitive materials, this route offered the safety of familiarity. And crucially, Portugal would later prove willing to shelter former Templars by transforming them into the Order of Christ, effectively preserving their structure under a new name. Another route pointed north. The British Isles lay within reach, and among them, Scotland held particular appeal. At the time, Scotland was under excommunication and in open defiance of both England and Rome. King Robert the Bruce had little reason to cooperate with papal directives. For fugitive Templars, this political isolation made Scotland a potential refuge. Sailing north was more dangerous. The waters were colder, storms more frequent, navigation more difficult. But danger can be an advantage. Few would expect an escape route that courted such risk. And legends would later emerge linking Templar knights to Scottish battles and secret settlements, though hard evidence remains elusive. A third option lay eastward, through the Strait of Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean. This route reconnected with familiar territory. Templar ports existed in Italy, Cyprus, and beyond. But the Mediterranean was crowded and watched. Papal authority was stronger there. An escape along these routes would have been more visible, more vulnerable to interception. This makes the Atlantic routes especially intriguing. Beyond Iberia and the British Isles lay waters less documented, less controlled. Fishing fleets had already ventured far into the Atlantic, following cod and herring. Sailors spoke of islands glimpsed in fog, currents that carried ships farther than intended. Knowledge of these waters was imperfect but growing. The Templars, with their emphasis on logistics and information, would have been aware of such reports. Whether they trusted them enough to stake an escape on them is another matter. But it is worth noting that the Atlantic offered something no other route could: anonymity. A ship sailing west vanished not just from sight, but from expectation. This possibility has fueled centuries of speculation. Did the Templars reach lands unknown to Europe at the time? Did they establish temporary refuges, waiting for the political storm to pass? There is no definitive proof, but the absence of evidence cuts both ways. A successful disappearance would leave little trace by design. More conservative explanations remain compelling. The ships may have split up, each taking a different route. This would reduce risk and ensure that not everything was lost to a single misfortune. Decentralization had always been a Templar strength. Applying it to escape would be consistent with their methods. If this was the case, then the story of the vanished fleet is not a single journey but many. Some ships may have reached safe harbor and quietly integrated into new roles. Others may have been lost to storms, piracy, or betrayal. The lack of uniform outcomes would explain the fragmented legends that followed. What is striking is the absence of royal pursuit. Once the initial shock passed, there was no recorded naval chase, no coordinated effort to intercept the fugitives. This could reflect limited naval capacity on the part of the French crown. Or it could reflect reluctance. A failed pursuit would only highlight the king's incomplete victory. The routes the ships might have taken also illuminate what they likely carried. A voyage to Portugal or Scotland suggests survival and integration. A journey into the open Atlantic suggests secrecy and long-term concealment. Each choice reflects a different priority. It is also possible that the ships did not all depart from La Rochelle at once. Some may have left earlier under routine pretexts, positioning themselves in advance. Others may have followed later, once the arrests began. This staggered movement would further complicate any attempt to trace them. Weather records, sparse as they are, do not report unusual storms at that time. This absence removes one convenient explanation. The ships were not forced off course by disaster. Their disappearance appears deliberate. Over time, the question of routes became entangled with myth. Maps were reinterpreted. Symbols were scrutinized. Every unexplained island or ruin became a potential Templar trace. While much of this speculation lacks discipline, it reflects a deeper intuition that the escape, if it occurred, was not random. The Templars were planners. They did not improvise survival. They engineered it. Understanding possible routes also reframes the role of the sea itself. The ocean was not just a medium of escape, but a barrier against memory. On land, records accumulate. On water, they dissolve. A ship's path leaves no trail once the wake fades. This is why the question of routes matters so deeply. It is not about pinpointing a destination on a map. It is about recognizing that the Templars chose spaces where history struggled to follow. Whether they sailed south to safety, north to defiance, or west into uncertainty, the common thread is intention. The ships did not wander. They withdrew. And in doing so, they transformed the nature of the mystery. The fall of the order was recorded in meticulous detail. The escape was not. That imbalance is not accidental. It reflects where power still lingered. The vanished routes remind us that history favors the visible. What moves quietly, strategically, and beyond expectation often survives without record. The Templars, masters of systems, understood this well. Their ships did not need to return. They needed only to arrive. And wherever that arrival took place, it occurred beyond the reach of kings, popes, and chroniclers. The sea closed behind them, and with it, the certainty that history had told the whole story. In the early 14th century, Scotland stood apart from the rest of Europe like a land suspended outside the rules. It was a kingdom under siege not just by English armies, but by the authority of Rome itself. When Robert the Bruce seized the Scottish crown, he did so in defiance of the papacy. The consequence was excommunication. Churches fell silent. Sacraments were withheld. In the eyes of Christendom, Scotland became a spiritual exile. For men fleeing the combined power of king and pope, this isolation mattered. Excommunication was meant to be a punishment, but it also created a strange form of freedom. Papal decrees carried little weight in a land already cast out. Royal orders from France meant nothing there. Scotland existed in a legal and spiritual gray zone, and that made it dangerous but also invisible. This is why Scotland appears so often in the legends surrounding the Knights Templar. Not as a place of triumph, but as a place of refuge. Sailing north from France into Scottish waters was perilous. The North Sea was unforgiving, its storms sudden and brutal. Navigation was difficult, coastlines jagged and poorly charted. Yet danger was precisely what made this route effective. Few would follow willingly. Fewer still would survive pursuit. If Templar ships did reach Scotland, they would have arrived quietly. No proclamations would greet them. No records would announce their presence. What they would have found instead was a country fighting for survival, in need of experienced warriors and administrators. Scottish chronicles speak of unexpected forces appearing at critical moments. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce achieved a decisive victory against the English. Later legends claim that a mysterious contingent of armored knights entered the battle at its climax, turning the tide. These stories emerged generations after the fact, and their accuracy is debated. But their persistence is telling. The idea of Templars fighting at Bannockburn is not provable. It is also not impossible. Former Templars, stripped of identity but not skill, would have found purpose in Scotland's struggle. Fighting for a king already condemned by Rome would have aligned with their own predicament. Beyond the battlefield, Scotland offered something equally valuable: distance. It lay far from the centers of papal and royal administration. Its rugged terrain discouraged centralized oversight. Communities were small, loyal, and insular. A man could vanish there more easily than in the courts of France or Italy. Scottish monasteries and noble households may have absorbed former Templars without recording their origins. A skilled knight did not need to advertise his past to earn protection. Silence was enough. There are also architectural curiosities. Certain Scottish sites display symbols and design elements reminiscent of Templar imagery. Rosslyn Chapel, built in the 15th century, is often cited. Its carvings are unusual, dense with symbolism that does not fit neatly into Orthodox Christian art. Whether these reflect Templar influence or later imagination remains debated, but the fascination persists because the patterns invite interpretation. Critics argue that such connections are retrospective, imposed by modern minds seeking mystery. That criticism has merit, yet it does not erase the broader context. Scotland was uniquely positioned to receive those who could not exist elsewhere. Another factor often overlooked is the political pragmatism of Robert the Bruce. He needed allies. He needed legitimacy. Former Templars, with their reputation for discipline and their knowledge of continental politics, would have been assets. Offering them protection in exchange for service would have been a calculated decision. This relationship, if it existed, would have been mutually beneficial and mutually discreet. Public acknowledgement would invite retaliation. Silence ensured survival. Over time, as Scotland's position stabilized and relations with the Church improved, any such arrangements would have faded into normalcy. Former Templars would become simply knights, advisors, or landholders. Their past would dissolve into the present. The lack of direct evidence frustrates scholars, but it is precisely what one would expect from a successful refuge. Records expose. Silence protects. What Scotland represents in the Templar story is not a hidden kingdom or secret order, but a moment of possibility. A space where the rigid structures of medieval authority weakened, allowing alternative paths. The broader pattern matters more than any single legend. Across Europe, Templars disappeared into places where papal reach was limited or negotiable. Portugal formalized this process through reorganization. Scotland may have done so informally, through necessity and silence. In both cases, the result was the same: continuity without confrontation. Scotland's excommunication made it a paradoxical sanctuary. Cast out by the Church, it became a place where the Church's enemies could live unrecorded. The very punishment meant to isolate it created an opening for others. The sea route to Scotland, dangerous and uncertain, fits the larger logic of the vanished ships. It was not the easiest path, but it was the least visible. And for men who needed to disappear, visibility was the greatest threat. Whether or not Templar banners ever flew on Scottish soil, the idea that they could have is enough to challenge the narrative of total destruction. It suggests that survival took many forms, not all of them dramatic. The legends endure because they speak to a deeper truth. When authority fractures, margins become havens. Scotland, in its defiance and isolation, embodied that margin. And in the shadow of that defiance, it is possible that men without a name found a way to live on, no longer as Templars, but as something quieter, and therefore harder to erase. While much of Europe moved quickly to arrest, imprison, or disperse the Knights Templar, Portugal took a different path. It was not born of sentimentality or defiance, but of calculation. The Portuguese crown had long understood the value of the order, not as an abstract religious institution, but as a practical force that had helped shape the kingdom itself. To discard that force entirely would have been wasteful. Instead, Portugal chose transformation over destruction. The relationship between Portugal and the Templars predated the crisis by generations. From the 12th century onward, the order had played a critical role in defending Portugal's borders during the Reconquista. They built castles, settled frontier lands, and administered territories that were both militarily and economically vital. Their presence was not theoretical. It was woven into the fabric of the kingdom. By the early 14th century, Portuguese rulers saw the Templars less as outsiders and more as partners. They understood local conditions, managed land efficiently, and provided stability in contested regions. Unlike in France, where the order's independence provoked resentment, in Portugal it complemented royal authority. When news of the arrests in France reached Lisbon, King Denis of Portugal faced a choice: obey papal and royal pressure and dismantle the order, or protect an institution that had proven its worth. Denis was a pragmatic ruler. He did not deny the accusations outright, but he questioned their timing and motives. Rather than move immediately against the Templars, Denis opened an inquiry of his own. The results were telling. No convincing evidence of heresy emerged. No secret rites were uncovered. The Portuguese Templars appeared, by all accounts, to be what they had always been: disciplined, devout, and loyal to their mission. This local investigation provided Denis with political cover. He could argue that while abuses might have occurred elsewhere, they did not define the order as a whole. It was a subtle but important distinction. As pressure from Rome intensified, Denis negotiated. He accepted the formal dissolution of the Knights Templar as an institution, but he refused to allow their assets or personnel to be seized by foreign interests. Instead, he proposed a solution that would preserve both royal authority and practical continuity. In 1319, the Order of Christ was established. On paper, it was a new organization, free of the Templars' tainted reputation. In practice, it was the Templars reborn. The same lands, the same castles, the same men. Even the symbol, a red cross modified slightly, echoed the past. This rebranding was more than cosmetic. It represented a deliberate act of preservation. By transferring Templar assets into a new order under royal oversight, Denis ensured that their expertise remained within Portugal while satisfying papal demands. For former Templars, this transition offered something rare: legitimacy. They did not have to vanish into anonymity or deny their past. They could continue serving openly, albeit under a new name. Their skills were not lost. Their identity was reshaped rather than erased. The implications of this decision would echo far beyond Portugal's borders. The Order of Christ became deeply involved in maritime activity. Its headquarters at Tomar sat at the heart of Portugal's strategic network. Over time, it would support voyages along the African coast and into the Atlantic. Prince Henry the Navigator, one of the central figures of the Age of Discovery, served as Grand Master of the Order of Christ in the 15th century. Under his leadership, Portuguese exploration accelerated dramatically. Ships ventured farther than before, guided by improved navigation, funding, and institutional support. The connection between this expansion and the legacy of the Templars is often overstated, but it is not imaginary. The administrative practices, financial structures, and long-term thinking that characterized the Templars found a new home within the Order of Christ. This continuity suggests that whatever knowledge or resources may have escaped France found fertile ground in Portugal. Even if no ships from La Rochelle arrived directly, the philosophical alignment is striking. Both institutions valued planning, secrecy, and endurance. Portugal's geographic position amplified this effect. Facing the Atlantic, the kingdom looked outward. Exploration was not a luxury, but a necessity. The sea offered opportunity where land was limited. Institutions that understood maritime logistics thrived. The Order of Christ provided exactly that. It channeled resources into shipbuilding, training, and navigation. It supported innovation while maintaining strict oversight. In many ways, it embodied the lessons the Templars had learned centuries earlier. Critics argue that linking the vanished Templar ships to Portugal romanticizes the story. They point out that no contemporary record confirms such an arrival. This is true, but absence of record is not absence of influence. Portugal's transformation demonstrates what survival could look like without secrecy. Rather than hide, the Templar legacy in Portugal adapted. It aligned itself with royal ambition and outward expansion. It traded the defense of pilgrims for the pursuit of new horizons. This adaptation also explains why Portugal did not pursue the Templars with the same zeal as France. Denis did not see them as a rival. He saw them as a resource. In a broader sense, Portugal offers a counterpoint to the narrative of betrayal and destruction. It shows that the fall of the order was not inevitable. It was contingent, shaped by local politics, personalities, and priorities. Where France saw a threat, Portugal saw potential. Where one king sought erasure, another chose continuity. This divergence underscores a central theme of the Templar story. Institutions do not survive by force alone. They survive by relevance. The Templars remained relevant in Portugal because they adapted to the kingdom's needs. The Order of Christ stands as proof that the Templars' disappearance was not universal. It was selective. In some places, the order died loudly. In others, it lived on quietly. Portugal's choice ensured that whatever the Templars represented, discipline, organization, long-term vision, did not vanish with the arrests. It flowed forward, reshaped into a new era. And in the sails of Portuguese ships that would soon cross unknown seas, one can glimpse the enduring shadow of an order that refused to end, choosing instead to change. By the early 15th century, Europe stood on the edge of a transformation it could not yet name. The world was larger than maps suggested, and the sea no longer felt like a barrier but an invitation. When Portuguese ships began pushing steadily down the African coast and into the open Atlantic, historians would later credit ambition, curiosity, and royal patronage. But beneath those visible causes lay something quieter and more enduring. A system that knew how to plan for the long term, how to fund risk, and how to move knowledge without drawing attention. The Templars had never been explorers in the romantic sense. They did not chase horizons for their own sake. Yet they understood movement better than most medieval institutions. Their survival depended on supply lines, safe passages, and the coordination of distant outposts. Over generations, they refined methods for managing uncertainty. That mindset did not vanish with the order's dissolution. In Portugal, these habits found new purpose. The Order of Christ inherited not just lands and castles, but administrative memory. It knew how to organize men across distances, how to fund ventures whose returns were uncertain, and how to absorb failure without collapse. These qualities were exactly what oceanic exploration required. Exploration in the medieval world was not heroic improvisation. It was expensive, dangerous, and politically sensitive. Ships were costly to build and maintain. Crews had to be paid. Losses were common. Only an institution capable of spreading risk over time could sustain repeated voyages. The Order of Christ provided that stability. It functioned as a financial and logistical backbone for early exploration. It gathered resources quietly, distributed them efficiently, and reinvested returns strategically. This approach mirrors the Templar model so closely that the resemblance is difficult to ignore. Navigation itself also reflects continuity. Portuguese mariners began to master techniques that pushed beyond traditional coastal sailing. Improved charts, better understanding of winds and currents, and standardized training transformed what was possible. Knowledge accumulated incrementally, preserved within institutions rather than scattered among individuals. This method of knowledge preservation echoes Templar practice. The order had always emphasized collective memory. Lessons learned in one place were transmitted elsewhere. Experience was not allowed to die with individuals. Such an approach is essential when exploring unknown waters, where mistakes are fatal. There is no evidence that the Templars possessed secret maps of the world or knowledge of distant continents. That myth belongs more to later imagination than to medieval reality. But they did possess something more valuable, a framework for learning. They understood that progress comes from iteration, from documenting failure as carefully as success. The age of discovery unfolded slowly. Each voyage built upon the last. Cape after cape was rounded. Currents were mapped. What made this possible was not a single breakthrough, but sustained commitment. Institutions, not heroes, drove the process. The Red Cross of the Order of Christ, visible on Portuguese sails, became a symbol of this continuity. It marked ships that were not acting in isolation, but as part of a coordinated effort. Behind each voyage stood an apparatus of planning, financing, and analysis. This apparatus did not seek attention. Unlike crusading banners raised in open war, exploration required discretion. Political rivals watched closely. Too much display invited interference. Quiet success was safer than loud ambition. In this sense, the transition from Templar to Order of Christ represents a shift in how power was expressed. Military dominance gave way to logistical mastery. Control of territory was replaced by control of routes. Influence flowed along sea lanes rather than borders. The vanished Templar ships of 1307 take on new meaning in this context. Whether or not they directly contributed to Portuguese exploration, they represent a moment when the order embraced the sea as its primary domain. That instinct, once formed, did not disappear. Exploration also required a different relationship with uncertainty. Medieval warfare sought decisive outcomes. Exploration did not. It accepted ambiguity. Voyages returned with partial information. Some never returned at all. Institutions that demanded immediate results would fail. The Templars had lived with uncertainty for centuries. Campaigns in the Holy Land were unpredictable. Alliances shifted. Defeats were common. The order learned to persist without guarantees. That resilience is visible again in Portugal's patient push into the Atlantic. Prince Henry the Navigator's role is often overstated, but his position as Grand Master of the Order of Christ mattered. He stood at the intersection of royal ambition and institutional capacity. He could draw on resources without explaining every decision publicly. This autonomy allowed experimentation. Such autonomy had once defined the Templars. Answering only to the Pope, they operated beyond local constraints. In Portugal, the Order of Christ enjoyed similar freedom under royal protection. The parallel is striking. Critics caution against attributing too much to institutional legacy. They argue that exploration arose from broader economic and technological trends. This is true, but institutions determine how societies respond to trends. Portugal responded with sustained action. Others hesitated. The reason lies not only in geography, but in readiness. Portugal had inherited a system comfortable with long horizons. It did not expect immediate conquest or wealth. It accepted incremental gain. This patience would eventually reshape the world. Trade routes expanded. New lands entered European awareness. Power shifted from Mediterranean states to Atlantic ones. The consequences were profound and often brutal. In this transformation, the Templar legacy is not one of secret domination, but of structural influence. The order did not survive as a visible entity, but its methods did. They adapted to a new era, serving new goals. This reframing helps explain why no dramatic revelation of Templar survival ever occurred. Survival did not require recognition. It required relevance. The ships that once guarded pilgrims had become obsolete. The ships that explored oceans were the future. Institutions that understood this transition thrived. By the time Europe realized what was happening, the patterns were already set. The world had expanded, and with it, the reach of those who mastered movement. The Templars did not discover new continents, but their way of thinking, systematic, patient, resilient, helped shape the age that did. And in that sense, the greatest secret they carried was not a map or a treasure, but a method. For centuries after the fall of the Knights Templar, seekers searched for something tangible that would justify the scale of their destruction. If the order had been so wealthy, so powerful, so feared, then surely it must have left behind a hoard worth seizing. Gold hidden in forests, silver buried beneath ruined chapels, relics sealed inside forgotten crypts. And yet, despite relentless searching, no confirmed Templar treasure has ever been found. This absence is not a footnote. It is the mystery itself. When royal officials catalogued Templar properties after the arrests, they expected vast riches. Instead, what they found was underwhelming. There was wealth, yes, land, buildings, stored goods, but nothing approaching the legendary fortunes rumored for decades. The numbers did not match the stories. Ledgers hinted at assets that were no longer present. Counts felt incomplete. At first, this discrepancy was blamed on exaggeration. Medieval rumor was notorious for inflating wealth and power, but the longer the gap persisted, the harder it became to dismiss. The Templars had been Europe's bankers. Kings had borrowed from them. Pilgrims trusted them with fortunes. Where had it all gone? Treasure hunters have proposed countless answers. Some claimed the gold was buried in France before the arrests. Others pointed to Scotland, Portugal, or the Holy Land. Each generation rediscovered the mystery and reshaped it according to its own hopes. Maps were drawn, symbols decoded, ruins excavated. Still nothing. The failure of these searches suggests a flaw in the question itself. It assumes that the Templars measured value the same way later generations did. It imagines treasure as something heavy, glittering, and stationary. But the Order's true strength had never been static wealth. It was mobility. Gold sitting in a vault is vulnerable. It can be seized, taxed, stolen, or destroyed. The Templars understood this. Their wealth flowed. It existed as credit, obligation, and trust. Much of it was never meant to be physically present in one place. When the arrests came, whatever gold remained in obvious locations was lost. That loss did not cripple the Order, because gold was not its core asset. Expecting to find a lost hoard misunderstands how the Templars operated. Another reason no treasure appeared is that hiding it would have been pointless. A buried hoard benefits no one until it is recovered. Recovery requires continuity, knowledge passed down, markers remembered, secrecy maintained across generations. That kind of secrecy is fragile. One betrayal, one death, one forgotten detail, and the treasure is lost forever. The Templars were practical. They would not entrust their future to something so unreliable. If they did move material wealth, it was likely redistributed, not hidden. Funds could be absorbed into allied institutions, invested quietly, or converted into forms that blended with local economies. Gold could become land. Silver could become ships. Value could change shape. This would explain why no dramatic discovery ever occurred. There was nothing dramatic to find. The idea of a missing hoard persists because it offers closure. It suggests that the mystery has a solution waiting to be uncovered. But history does not always resolve itself so neatly. Sometimes the truth is that expectations were misplaced. What if the treasure never appeared because it was never meant to? In this view, the disappearance of Templar wealth mirrors the disappearance of the Order itself. Both dissolve into systems rather than monuments. Influence replaces possession. Continuity replaces accumulation. This perspective also explains why the search for treasure often reveals more about the seekers than the sought. Each generation projects its values onto the past. In times of material obsession, treasure becomes gold. In times of ideological struggle, treasure becomes knowledge or power. The Templars lived in a world where survival depended on adaptability. They had learned that visibility attracts danger. Wealth that cannot be seen cannot be seized. Even the legends surrounding specific locations, Oak Island, Rosslyn Chapel, hidden caves and islands, share a common flaw. They assume the Templars chose permanence. Yet everything we know about the Order suggests the opposite. They thrived by avoiding fixation. The most compelling evidence against a hidden hoard is the Order's behavior during the arrests. If a great treasure existed, protecting it would have been a priority. But the Templars did not mount a defense. They did not bargain with its location. They did not attempt to retrieve it later. Their silence suggests there was no single cache whose loss or recovery would determine their fate. Silence can be strategic, but silence can also be honest. The real loss after 1307 was not gold, but structure. The Order's ability to coordinate across borders was shattered. Its name became poison. Its members were scattered. That damage could not be repaired with money. And yet, the Templars did not vanish entirely. Their methods reappeared. Their influence resurfaced. Their absence became presence in another form. If there was a treasure, it was not something that could be dug up. It was something that moved, adapted, and survived by refusing to be defined. This is deeply unsatisfying to those who crave discovery. But it aligns with the evidence. No treasure hunter has ever found a definitive Templar hoard because the Order did not leave one behind. They left behind a vacuum instead. A space filled with questions, speculation, and longing. That vacuum has endured longer than any pile of gold ever could. And perhaps that is the final irony. The treasure that never appeared has proven far more powerful than one that did. Keeps the story alive. Long after the last Templar had been imprisoned or absorbed into new orders, strange marks remained behind. They were carved into stone walls, hidden in chapel corners, woven into floor plans, and embedded in places that seemed deliberately chosen to outlast human memory. These were not obvious messages. They did not announce themselves. They waited. Medieval Europe was a world fluent in symbols. Most people could not read words, but they could read meaning. Shapes, gestures, and proportions carried messages understood by those trained to see them. The Knights Templar operated entirely within the symbolic language, and they used it with precision. To outsiders, Templar churches often looked simple, even austere. But to those who studied them closely, patterns emerged. Repeated geometries, unusual orientations, proportions that echoed sacred mathematics. These were not decorative accidents. They reflected an order that believed meaning could be encoded into space itself. The most obvious symbols were the crosses. Not all Templar crosses were the same. Some were flared, some equal-armed, some subtly altered. These variations mattered. In a world without standardized iconography, difference signaled intent. A trained eye could distinguish rank, function, or message from form alone. But crosses were only the surface layer. More intriguing were the less visible signs. Interlocking circles carved where few would look. Spirals placed just beyond easy reach. Numbers repeated in dimensions and spacing. These elements suggest that Templar builders worked from a shared symbolic vocabulary, one that extended beyond doctrine into geometry and proportion. Geometry was not abstract to medieval thinkers. It was sacred. Shapes reflected divine order. To build according to certain ratios was to align with cosmic truth. The Templars, exposed to both Western and Eastern traditions during the Crusades, may have encountered symbolic systems unfamiliar to most Europeans. Whether they adopted foreign ideas or simply refined existing ones remains debated. What matters is that their buildings communicated on more than one level. They were functional, devotional, and symbolic all at once. After the arrests, many Templar sites were repurposed. Churches changed hands. Commanderies became farms or administrative centers. But stone remembers even when people forget. Symbols carved into walls do not disappear when ownership changes. Later generations noticed them and wondered. Some carvings seemed out of place for Orthodox Christian settings. Faces with ambiguous expressions. Plants that did not match local flora. Motifs that appeared centuries before their supposed introduction to Europe. Individually, these details prove little. Collectively, they raise questions. Were these symbols decorative? Did they carry meaning? And if so, for whom? One possibility is that they served as internal markers, a way for members of the order to recognize safe spaces, allied sites, or shared identity without revealing anything to outsiders. In a time of persecution, such markers would be invaluable. Another possibility is more subtle. The symbols may have been designed to survive the order itself. Messages not for contemporaries, but for the future. This idea may seem romantic, but it aligns with how the Templars thought. They planned across generations. They understood that institutions fall, but ideas endure. If direct communication became impossible, indirect communication might remain. This is where the idea of code emerges, not as a secret cipher to be cracked, but as layered meaning accessible only to those prepared to see it. Medieval codes were not puzzles. They were filters. Only those with the right knowledge would recognize significance. The accusations of heresy leveled against the Templars focused heavily on symbols. Worship of idols, spitting on the cross, reverence for strange images. These claims, exaggerated as they were, reflect a deeper anxiety about symbolic power. Symbols shape belief. Control the symbols and you control meaning. It is possible that the Templars' symbolic language was misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented by their enemies. What one group saw as sacred geometry, another labeled blasphemy. In times of fear, difference becomes guilt. What makes this more compelling is the consistency of certain symbols across distant sites. Similar motifs appear in France, England, Portugal, and beyond. This suggests coordination. a shared template, a deliberate choice to leave a recognizable pattern. And yet, the pattern is incomplete. There is no master key. No single interpretation explains everything. This frustrates those seeking certainty, but it may be the point. A code that can be fully cracked loses its power. Perhaps the symbols were not meant to convey a single message, but to signal continuity. To say, we were here, and we understood something about the world that cannot be erased by decree. In this sense, the symbols function as memory anchors. They preserve a way of thinking rather than a set of facts. They resist simplification. Modern attempts to decode Templar symbolism often fall into extremes. Some dismiss it entirely as coincidence. Others inflate it into evidence of hidden knowledge bordering on the supernatural. Both miss the middle ground. The Templars were neither ignorant nor mystical in the modern sense. They were disciplined, educated, and pragmatic. They used symbols because symbols worked. They shaped loyalty, conveyed authority, and survived beyond spoken language. When the order fell, symbols became one of the few things that could not be confiscated. You can seize gold. You can burn documents. You can imprison men. But you cannot easily erase meaning carved into stone. This may explain why symbolic accusations were emphasized during the trials. By redefining symbols as heretical, the king and his allies sought to poison them, to make their very presence suspect. Yet symbols are resilient. Over time, their meanings shift, soften, or reemerge. What once provoked fear becomes curiosity. What was condemned becomes studied. Today, visitors stand in former Templar sites and feel something difficult to articulate. A sense of intention, of design beyond function. This feeling is not proof of secret knowledge, but it is evidence of care. The Templars built to last. Not just physically, but conceptually. If the order expected persecution, and there is reason to believe it did, then embedding meaning into structures would be a rational response. It allows communication without risk, preserves identity without exposure. In this light, the symbols are not clues to a treasure map or hidden doctrine. They are traces of resilience, markers left by people who understood that survival sometimes requires becoming invisible. The irony is that in trying to erase the Templars, their enemies ensured these symbols would attract attention. The very act of destruction transformed ordinary marks into mysteries, and so they endure, not as answers but as invitations, to look closer, to question narratives, to recognize that history is not only written in words, but carved into silence. The symbols remain because they were never meant to speak loudly. They were meant to wait. As the years of imprisonment and trial dragged on, the figure of Jacques de Molay emerged slowly from the shadows, not as a warrior or administrator, but as a symbol of endurance. He had been Grand Master of the Knights Templar for more than 2 decades, guiding the order through the loss of the Holy Land and into an uncertain future. By the time he was arrested in Paris, he was no longer a man of conquest. He was a man of memory. De Molay's capture was swift and unceremonious. He was taken without resistance, a detail that has puzzled historians ever since. Some see it as evidence of naivety. Others see it as acceptance. But acceptance does not mean ignorance. De Molay had witnessed betrayal before. He had negotiated with kings, navigated papal politics, and watched alliances crumble. He knew how fragile favor could be. During his imprisonment, de Molay was subjected to the same brutal interrogations as his brothers. Under torture, he confessed to some of the charges leveled against the order. These confessions were later recanted, reasserted, and recanted again, reflecting the unbearable pressure he endured. What stands out, however, is not what he said, but what he did not. At no point did de Molay reveal anything that could expose others beyond his immediate circumstances. He did not name co-conspirators. He did not describe secret plans or hidden routes. He did not attempt to bargain for his life with information. In a system designed to extract every possible detail, this silence is remarkable. Years passed. The trials lost urgency. Public interest waned. De Molay remained imprisoned, aging, waiting. The man who had once commanded an international order was reduced to a political inconvenience. His continued existence complicated matters. As long as he lived, the story was not finished. In 1314, after years of procedural delays, the authorities sought closure. De Molay and a small group of other leaders were brought before a commission and presented with a final opportunity. They could accept the previous confessions and receive life imprisonment, or they could recant and face execution. The choice was stark: survival at the cost of truth, or death with integrity. De Molay chose death. When he stood before the crowd on the Isle de la Cite, bound and weakened by years of captivity, he did something unexpected. He publicly withdrew his confessions, declaring the order innocent and the charges false. This was not a desperate act. It was measured, deliberate, and irreversible. In that moment, de Molay reclaimed control of the narrative. By recanting publicly, he exposed the fragility of the trials. A man who had confessed under torture now spoke freely. The contradiction could not be ignored. The response was immediate and brutal. That same evening, de Molay was sentenced to death as a relapsed heretic. The speed of the decision betrayed fear. Authorities did not want his words to linger. As the fire was prepared, witnesses noted de Molay's composure. He did not plead. He did not curse. He faced Notre Dame and prayed. His silence was as powerful as his final declaration. Legends later claimed that he called upon God to judge those responsible for his death, and that both the king and the pope died within a year. Whether this curse was spoken or invented later is less important than why it endured. It gave meaning to a death that otherwise might have faded into obscurity. De Molay's execution marked the symbolic end of the order. But symbolically, it also marked its transformation. By choosing silence over revelation and death over compromise, de Molay ensured that whatever the Templars still possessed, knowledge, continuity, or influence, remained intact. His refusal to negotiate is often interpreted as stubbornness or fanaticism, but in context it appears strategic. Any attempt to save himself by revealing secrets would have undone everything others may have worked to preserve. De Molay understood his role in that moment. He was not just a prisoner. He was a gate. By closing that gate, he protected those beyond it. The power of his silence lies in its finality. Torture could force words, but it could not force betrayal once he reclaimed agency. His death sealed the limits of the king's victory. In the years that followed, de Molay's name became a rallying point for memory. He was remembered not for conquest, but for constancy. His end was not glorious in the traditional sense, but it was resolute. For those inclined to believe that the Templars orchestrated a quiet survival, de Molay's behavior is central. He behaved like a man who knew that his death would not be the end of the story. That knowledge did not make him reckless. It made him careful. He did not need to speak. Others had already moved beyond reach. In a world obsessed with confession, his final silence stands out as an act of defiance. It denied his enemies the satisfaction of total exposure, preserved ambiguity, and ambiguity is fertile ground. It allows stories to grow, questions to persist, and influence to endure without form. Jacques de Molay did not save the order in life, but in death, he ensured that it could not be fully understood, fully condemned, or fully erased. Sometimes the strongest defense is not resistance, but restraint. And sometimes, silence speaks longer than any final word. After the flames consumed Jacques de Molay and the embers cooled along the banks of the Seine, a strange stillness settled over the story of the Knights Templar. Officially, it was over. The order was dissolved. Its leaders were dead or imprisoned. Its name was synonymous with heresy. And yet, almost immediately, something else began to circulate alongside the record of execution. A sense that the ending had been too convenient, too incomplete, too haunted to remain closed. Within months, rumors spread that de Molay had spoken a curse as he burned. According to the legend, he summoned both King Philip IV and Pope Clement V to appear before God's judgment within a year. Whether these words were truly spoken or later placed in his mouth is impossible to determine. But the power of the story lies not in its literal truth, but in its timing. In April 1314, Clement V died after a sudden illness. In November of the same year, Philip IV suffered a fatal accident while hunting. Two pillars of authority fell within months of the man they had condemned. To a medieval world steeped in providence and symbolism, coincidence was not a neutral concept. It was meaning. The deaths ignited the legend. People whispered that divine justice had intervened. Chroniclers recorded the sequence with thinly veiled unease. The curse story spread because it felt emotionally true, even if historically uncertain. From a modern perspective, the curse can be dismissed as folklore. Men died young in the 14th century. Illness and accidents were common. But to do so entirely misses its significance. Legends arise where trust has collapsed. They fill the gaps left by unresolved injustice. The curse gave voice to something that could not be expressed openly: doubt about the trials themselves. If the Templars were truly guilty, why did their persecutors fall so swiftly? The story inverted power. It turned a condemned heretic into a moral victor. This inversion mattered. It reshaped memory. In the years following Philip's death, France entered a period of instability. Succession crises weakened the monarchy. The direct Capetian line ended. The king who had orchestrated the Templars' destruction left no lasting legacy of strength. Instead, his reign became associated with debt, repression, and controversy. The Pope's death also carried symbolic weight. Clement V had dissolved the order without declaring it guilty, a decision that satisfied no one fully. His passing removed the last figure who might have clarified the Church's position. Silence replaced judgment. The curse legend offered a kind of closure where institutions had failed. It suggested that accountability existed beyond human courts, that justice, delayed and distorted, could still arrive. Importantly, the legend did not inspire rebellion. There was no uprising in de Molay's name, no movement to restore the order. The curse did not function as a call to action. It functioned as a warning. Warnings do not demand response. They demand reflection. The persistence of the curse story also reveals something about medieval psychology. Power was not seen as absolute. Kings ruled by divine favor, and that favor could be withdrawn. A sudden death was not random. It was interpreted. By linking the fall of powerful men to the execution of a condemned one, the legend rebalanced moral scales. It reminded listeners that authority could be wrong, and that punishment could rebound. This mattered deeply in a society where obedience was enforced through fear. The curse whispered that fear was not one-sided. Over time, the story grew. Details shifted. Some versions added other names. Others emphasized the king's suffering. These variations reflect how oral tradition adapts to need. The core remained constant: the idea that the Templars' destruction had consequences. Whether or not de Molay spoke the words attributed to him, his execution created a vacuum that demanded explanation. The curse filled that space. It also reinforced the mystery surrounding the order's end. If divine judgment had been invoked, then human judgment was suspect. This ambiguity protected the Templars' legacy from final condemnation. In this sense, the curse legend functions much like the vanished ships or the missing treasure. Preserves uncertainty. It resists closure. Modern historians tend to strip such stories of meaning, labeling them superstition. But superstition is simply belief shaped by context. The curse endured because it resonated with lived experience. People had seen power abused. They had seen truth manipulated. The legend affirmed their unease. There is also a subtler implication. By focusing attention on the deaths of Philip and Clement, the legend shifted focus away from practical questions. What happened to the order's resources? Its people? Its knowledge? These questions faded behind the drama of divine retribution. Myth can distract as effectively as it can illuminate. If the Templars had indeed orchestrated a quiet survival, the curse legend served them well. It locked the narrative in the past. It framed the story as concluded, morally resolved. No further investigation seemed necessary. The enemies of the order may have inadvertently helped secure its legacy by creating a story that felt complete. Centuries later, the curse still captures imagination. It endures because it speaks to a universal tension between power and justice. It suggests that even when institutions fail, meaning finds a way to assert itself. Whether divine or symbolic, the curse represents a psychological reckoning. It transforms de Molay from a victim into a judge, if only in memory. And memory is powerful. The deaths of Philip and Clement did not undo the damage done to the Templars. But they prevented the story from ending in simple triumph. They ensured that the final note was not victory, but unease. In the quiet that followed, questions remained. Not about guilt or innocence alone, but about consequence. About whether destruction always brings control. About whether silence can outlast authority. The curse legend does not answer these questions, preserves them, and in doing so, it keeps the story alive, suspended between history and meaning, where it has remained ever since. The dissolution of the Knights Templar was meant to be final. Decrees were issued, seals broken, properties redistributed, and the name itself condemned to infamy. On parchment, the order no longer existed. But institutions are not only defined by charters and titles. They are defined by habits, systems, and people. And those are far harder to destroy. Across Europe, former Templars faced a range of fates. Some were imprisoned until death. Others were absorbed into different religious orders, often reluctantly. A few returned to secular life, carrying skills shaped by decades of discipline. What they shared was experience, organizational knowledge that could not be erased by decree. The Templars had been more than soldiers. They were administrators, financiers, builders, and logisticians. Their training emphasized coordination across distance, secrecy when necessary, and loyalty to structure rather than personality. These traits did not vanish when the order did. They traveled with the men who embodied them. In regions where persecution was less severe, traces of Templar practice persisted. In Portugal, the transformation into the Order of Christ preserved much of the original framework openly. Elsewhere, survival was quieter. Former Templars found roles within hospitaller orders, military retinues, and royal administrations. Their influence blended rather than asserted itself. This blending is why no single successor order can be identified. The Templars did not reform under a new banner in most places. They diffused. Their methods seeped into existing structures. Consider medieval banking. The Templars had pioneered techniques for transferring value across borders, safeguarding deposits, and recording obligations. After their fall, similar practices continued under other institutions. This was not coincidence. Knowledge once learned is difficult to unlearn. The same is true of military organization. Units trained to operate cohesively, obeying centralized command, became increasingly common. Feudal levies gave way to standing forces. While many factors drove this change, the Templar example demonstrated its effectiveness. Even architectural practices show continuity. Fortified religious complexes, efficient estate management, and standardized layouts appear in later constructions. These designs favored durability and function over ornament, hallmarks of Templar philosophy. None of this required conscious preservation of the order's identity. In fact, anonymity was safer. By allowing their influence to become unremarkable, former Templars ensured it would endure. This phenomenon complicates the idea of survival. Survival does not always mean continuity of name. It can mean continuity of impact. In this sense, the Templars did not vanish. They dissolved into the fabric of European institutions. Their legacy became structural rather than symbolic. This also explains why conspiracy theories struggle to find concrete evidence. There was no secret council directing events from the shadows. There was no hidden headquarters. Influence flowed through systems, not commands. People trained within the same tradition tend to solve problems in similar ways. Over time, these patterns become normalized. Their origin fades. The suppression of the Templars also created a vacuum. Their absence forced other institutions to adapt. Banking expanded. Royal bureaucracies grew more sophisticated. Military orders restructured. In responding to the loss, Europe absorbed what the Templars had pioneered. Ironically, destruction accelerated diffusion. The order's emphasis on obedience, once seen as dangerous, became a model. Loyalty to abstract systems rather than individual leaders proved effective. Modern states would later adopt similar principles. There is also a psychological dimension. The memory of the Templars' fall served as a cautionary tale. Institutions learned to avoid the visibility that had doomed them. Power learned to cloak itself in normalcy. If the Templars survived in any meaningful sense, it was through this lesson. They demonstrated that overt independence invites annihilation. Subtle integration ensures longevity. This lesson resonated long after the last Templar had died. It shaped how organizations navigated authority, balancing influence with compliance. The idea of an order that would not die is less romantic than legend suggests, but more profound. It is the story of transformation under pressure, of adaptation without recognition. When historians search for Templar successors, they often look for symbols or declarations. They overlook process. The true legacy lies in how things were done, not what they were called. This reframing shifts the question. Instead of asking whether the Templars survived, we ask how their way of operating continued. And in answering that, we find them everywhere and nowhere at once. The absence of a visible order is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of success under hostile conditions. Power that announces itself can be challenged. Power that becomes mundane cannot. By disappearing into the ordinary, the Templars ensured that what they had built would outlast them. Their order died. Their methods did not. And in a world increasingly shaped by systems rather than individuals, that distinction matters more than any legend of secret survival ever could. The dissolution of the Knights Templar was meant to be final. Decrees were issued, seals broken, properties redistributed, and the name itself condemned to infamy. On parchment, the order no longer existed. But institutions are not only defined by charters and titles. They are defined by habits, systems, and people. And those are far harder to destroy. Across Europe, former Templars faced a range of fates. Some were imprisoned until death. Others were absorbed into different religious orders, often reluctantly. A few returned to secular life, carrying skills shaped by decades of discipline. What they shared was experience, organizational knowledge that could not be erased by decree. The Templars had been more than soldiers. They were administrators, financiers, builders, and logisticians. Their training emphasized coordination across distance, secrecy when necessary, and loyalty to structure rather than personality. These traits did not vanish when the order did. They traveled with the men who embodied them. In regions where persecution was less severe, traces of Templar practice persisted. In Portugal, the transformation into the Order of Christ preserved much of the original framework openly. Elsewhere, survival was quieter. Former Templars found roles within hospitaller orders, military retinues, and royal administrations. Their influence blended rather than asserted itself. This blending is why no single successor order can be identified. The Templars did not reform under a new banner in most places. They diffused. Their methods seeped into existing structures. Consider medieval banking. The Templars had pioneered techniques for transferring value across borders, safeguarding deposits, and recording obligations. After their fall, similar practices continued under other institutions. This was not coincidence. Knowledge once learned is difficult to unlearn. The same is true of military organization. Units trained to operate cohesively, obeying centralized command, became increasingly common. Feudal levies gave way to standing forces. While many factors drove this change, the Templar example demonstrated its effectiveness. Even architectural practices show continuity. Fortified religious complexes, efficient estate management, and standardized layouts appear in later constructions. These designs favored durability and function over ornament, hallmarks of Templar philosophy. None of this required conscious preservation of the order's identity. In fact, anonymity was safer. By allowing their influence to become unremarkable, former Templars ensured it would endure. This phenomenon complicates the idea of survival. Survival does not always mean continuity of name. It can mean continuity of impact. In this sense, the Templars did not vanish. They dissolved into the fabric of European institutions. Their legacy became structural rather than symbolic. This also explains why conspiracy theories struggle to find concrete evidence. There was no secret council directing events from the shadows. There was no hidden headquarters. Influence flowed through systems, not commands. People trained within the same tradition tend to solve problems in similar ways. Over time, these patterns become normalized. Their origin fades. The suppression of the Templars also created a vacuum. Their absence forced other institutions to adapt. Banking expanded. Royal bureaucracies grew more sophisticated. Military orders restructured. In responding to the loss, Europe absorbed what the Templars had pioneered. Ironically, destruction accelerated diffusion. The order's emphasis on obedience, once seen as dangerous, became a model. Loyalty to abstract systems rather than individual leaders proved effective. Modern states would later adopt similar principles. There is also a psychological dimension. The memory of the Templars' fall served as a cautionary tale. Institutions learned to avoid the visibility that had doomed them. Power learned to cloak itself in normalcy. If the Templars survived in any meaningful sense, it was through this lesson. They demonstrated that overt independence invites annihilation. Subtle integration ensures longevity. This lesson resonated long after the last Templar had died. It shaped how organizations navigated authority, balancing influence with compliance. The idea of an order that would not die is less romantic than legend suggests, but more profound. It is the story of transformation under pressure, of adaptation without recognition. When historians search for Templar successors, they often look for symbols or declarations. They overlook process. The true legacy lies in how things were done, not what they were called. This reframing shifts the question. Instead of asking whether the Templars survived, we ask how their way of operating continued. And in answering that, we find them everywhere and nowhere at once. The absence of a visible order is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of success under hostile conditions. Power that announces itself can be challenged. Power that becomes mundane cannot. By disappearing into the ordinary, the Templars ensured that what they had built would outlast them. Their order died. Their methods did not. And in a world increasingly shaped by systems rather than individuals, that distinction matters more than any legend of secret survival ever could. Even as the Knights Templar ceased to exist in name, their influence quietly persisted, woven into the fabric of European society in ways both subtle and profound. The Order's disappearance did not erase the networks, knowledge, or systems that had been honed over 2 centuries. Instead, these elements diffused, influencing institutions, economies, and strategies far beyond the reach of kings and popes who had sought their annihilation. Understanding this diffusion is crucial, for it reveals that survival is not always literal, and influence can outlast visibility. The Templars were masters of organization. Their commanderies were not just religious centers. They were hubs of administration, finance, and logistics. Each function, whether managing lands, overseeing supply chains, or coordinating international correspondence, was executed with meticulous care. These systems were designed to endure beyond any single individual or fortress. When the order was dissolved, the knowledge embedded in these networks did not vanish. Individuals who had operated within them carried that expertise into new roles, allowing Templar methods to propagate quietly across Europe. In the realm of finance, the Templars had pioneered techniques that would later underpin modern banking. They created secure methods for transferring wealth across borders, offering deposit services to pilgrims, nobles, and monarchs alike. The sophistication of their accounting, the use of letters of credit, and the management of collateral were all remarkable for their time. When the order fell, the knowledge of these practices survived. Former Templars working in other institutions, or in the courts of sympathetic rulers like those in Portugal, applied these methods. Even in secular and ecclesiastical administration, Templar-style financial management became embedded, influencing practices that persisted long after the order's formal extinction. Similarly, the Templars' expertise in logistics and military coordination left an enduring mark. Their experience in organizing armies, supplying distant fortresses, and maintaining disciplined hierarchies offered models for subsequent orders and armies. Even monarchies that had opposed the Templars found themselves, perhaps unknowingly, adopting strategies shaped by Templar precedents. Supply depots, permanent garrisons, and structured chains of command became standard, illustrating how techniques developed for one organization could survive its destruction. The architectural legacy of the order also reflects this diffusion. Templar castles and commanderies emphasized functionality, defense, and sustainability over ostentation. Standardized layouts, integrated fortifications, and multipurpose designs were features that influenced later constructions across Europe. Even when buildings were repurposed by other orders or secular authorities, the structural logic remained, silently transmitting principles of efficiency and foresight. In this way, the Templars' approach to space, resource management, and strategic design persisted without the need for formal continuity. Another dimension of their influence was cultural and symbolic. The Templars cultivated a distinct identity grounded in discipline, loyalty, and shared purpose. This identity survived in the habits and behaviors of individuals who had been trained within the order. Former Templars absorbed into other institutions carried with them expectations about duty, hierarchy, and operational precision. Over time, these traits filtered into the cultures of new organizations, reinforcing standards of conduct and institutional resilience. The influence was indirect but profound. The order's ethos became embedded in European administrative and military culture, shaping practice even in the absence of overt recognition. Portugal serves as a striking example of this continuity. The establishment of the Order of Christ was not simply a replacement. It was a conscious preservation of Templar infrastructure, personnel, and expertise. Castles, lands, and personnel were repurposed to serve the crown's ambitions, particularly maritime exploration. Administrative systems, logistical knowledge, and financial networks were maintained, forming a foundation for Portugal's later dominance in Atlantic exploration. The methods the Templars had honed for long-range coordination, risk management, and resource allocation proved ideally suited to managing voyages that pushed into the unknown. In this sense, the Order's influence extended centuries beyond its formal demise, shaping global history in unexpected ways. Even outside Portugal, former Templars influenced European society in less visible ways. Monasteries, hospitaller orders, and royal courts absorbed their expertise, allowing principles of strategic planning, risk assessment, and discipline management to propagate. While these individuals may have left no overt record of their past, the techniques they employed reflected the rigor and foresight cultivated by the Templars. Over decades, these contributions coalesced into practices that were no longer associated with the order, yet remained undeniably shaped by it. Perhaps most intriguingly, the Templars' emphasis on secrecy, contingency planning, and resilience left an enduring intellectual legacy. Their approach to risk, anticipating political betrayal, maintaining redundancy in resources, and preparing for worst-case scenarios, became a blueprint for survival in turbulent times. Institutions that learned from these practices could endure, adapt, and thrive even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The Templars' methods demonstrated that longevity often depends less on wealth or visibility than on systems, preparation, and discretion. The diffusion of influence also reshaped the narrative of power itself. The Templars had been destroyed overtly, but their methods outlasted their name. This inversion challenged contemporary assumptions about authority. True endurance does not necessarily require dominance in the public eye. Invisible systems can shape events long after the actors themselves have disappeared. In this way, the Order's legacy became more durable than any monument, more pervasive than any record of treasure or title. Importantly, the Templars' enduring influence illustrates that survival is multidimensional. It is not merely a matter of existing physically or maintaining an institutional name. Survival encompasses knowledge, methods, habits, and culture. The Order may have ceased to function formally, but it persisted conceptually and operationally. Its practices informed new generations of administrators, warriors, and explorers, subtly shaping the trajectory of European and even global history. This perspective also reframes the interpretation of myths and legends surrounding the Templars. Tales of hidden treasure, vanished ships, and secret societies often obscure the more significant reality. The order survived through its methods rather than its symbols. Myths endure because they capture imagination. Influence endures because it operates quietly, integrated into the machinery of society. By understanding this, one appreciates the Templars not as a vanished relic, but as a blueprint for enduring structures and practices. In the end, the story of Templar survival is not one of dramatic returns or recovered hordes. It is the story of invisible endurance, of systems and habits persisting beyond the reach of decree and fire. Where kings sought to erase them, their methods quietly reshaped institutions. Where chroniclers sought to condemn them, their practices silently continued. The Templars' death was visible. Their survival was structural. This enduring influence underscores a central paradox. The order that appeared destroyed was, in many ways, more resilient than those who persecuted it imagined. Its physical demise masked the persistence of its methods, culture, and systems. The Templars became invisible, not powerless. Their legacy spread quietly, shaping banking, military organization, architecture, and administration long after their name faded from official records. And in that quiet survival, one sees the ultimate triumph. The ability to endure without recognition, to influence without presence, to persist in ways that no decree, no trial, no execution could erase. The Knights Templar, though formally gone, continue to shape the world in ways subtle, enduring, and profound. Even as the practical systems of the Templars survived, another layer of their legacy took shape in legend, rumor, and myth. Across Europe, stories of vanished ships, secret treasures, and hidden knowledge circulated for decades, sometimes centuries. These tales were often dismissed as fanciful, the product of imagination and longing. Yet, when examined carefully, they reveal something deeper, the cultural imprint of an order that had been both feared and admired, and the ways in which memory itself can preserve influence long after physical institutions vanish. The myths surrounding the Templars were remarkably consistent in theme. They emphasized secrecy, sudden disappearance, and continuity beyond visible power. Ships that had vanished from La Rochelle, treasures that had never been found, rituals that were never fully understood. All these elements recurred across regions and generations. The persistence of such stories reflects the human need to make sense of sudden disappearance, to assign narrative to loss, and to frame morality through story. What is particularly striking is how these myths intersect with real historical events. The arrest of Templars in France, the swift dissolution of the order, and the executions of its leaders created fertile ground for speculation. When a powerful organization was dismantled overnight, people naturally asked how it could have vanished so completely. The stories that emerged were attempts to reconcile the visible destruction with the sense that an organization of such capability could not simply disappear. In Portugal, the Order of Christ provided a unique twist to the myth. Here, the Templars did not vanish, they transformed. Yet, for chroniclers elsewhere, the disappearance of the order's name fed the narrative of secrecy. The visible absence contrasted with ongoing activity, reinforcing the sense that the Templars had mastered the art of existing out of sight. These contradictions fueled legends that their influence had traveled across seas and borders, unseen and untraceable. Scotland provided another layer to the mythology. Tales of mysterious knights appearing at pivotal battles, of secret settlements in remote highlands, suggested that some Templars had fled northward, carrying knowledge, skills, and possibly wealth with them. While evidence is scarce, the consistency of these stories across local lore indicates that communities preserved memory through narrative. Even if the details were distorted, the underlying recognition of Templar presence and competence endured. The persistence of these stories demonstrates a critical point. Cultural survival is different from institutional survival. A name, a title, or an office can be extinguished. A reputation, a method, or a narrative can endure. The Templars' mythos became a medium for continuity, a way for knowledge and influence to persist without formal recognition. In many ways, the legends acted as a vessel for ideas the order could no longer carry openly. Moreover, myths serve as social memory. They encode lessons about power, authority, and consequence. The recurring theme of hidden treasure, for example, may not reflect literal wealth, but rather the recognition that the order possessed resources, financial, intellectual, or strategic, that were suddenly inaccessible. Stories of secret knowledge highlight the same principle. The Templars' value lay not in what could be seized, but in what could be applied, preserved, or mobilized. The legends also interact with morality. Tales of curses, divine retribution, or unseen justice suggest that people were grappling with questions of fairness, guilt, and authority. If the king and pope had acted wrongly, how could that be reconciled with faith in divine order? The narrative of de Molay's curse provided a framework for moral equilibrium. It asserted that, even when human institutions failed, justice remained possible. Myths thus became a mechanism for preserving moral lessons alongside historical memory. At the same time, the myths ensured that the Templars remained relevant in imagination. Unlike many dissolved institutions, which fade into obscurity once physical power is removed, the Templars' story continued to captivate. Artists, writers, and chroniclers retold their story, often embellishing it with symbolism, adventure, and intrigue. The legend became a lens through which successive generations explored questions of secrecy, loyalty, and resilience. It is also important to consider the psychological function of these stories. In a world shaped by authority, sudden disappearance generates anxiety. The Templars' eradication by royal and papal power was dramatic and total in appearance, yet inexplicable in scope. Humans respond to unexplained loss by constructing narratives. Legends of escape, hidden treasure, and secret knowledge fulfilled that need, providing closure while maintaining suspense. They allowed communities to grapple with the implications of sudden institutional collapse. The mythology further reinforced the Templars' perceived genius. Stories of vanished ships and elusive treasures suggest strategic foresight, the ability to anticipate danger, and mastery of logistics. These tales highlight qualities admired by contemporaries and by later generations alike. Even without formal recognition, the Templars' reputation for competence, discipline, and adaptability was preserved and amplified. Interestingly, myths also serve as a bridge between reality and possibility. They allowed people to speculate about what the Templars might have achieved if they had survived, creating a space where imagination and historical inference intersect. The idea of hidden knowledge, secret routes, or undiscovered relics invites contemplation of the organization's sophistication and foresight, even when physical evidence is absent. Legends thus operate as cognitive frameworks, shaping how history is interpreted, remembered, and felt. This interplay between myth and reality highlights the Templars' enduring influence. Practical knowledge may have diffused quietly into new institutions, but the stories surrounding the order amplified and preserved their symbolic power. Together, these elements created a dual legacy, one structural and operational, the other narrative and cultural. Both forms of survival were equally important for the order's long-term imprint on European consciousness. The persistence of Templar myths also reveals how society negotiates absence. Where physical and political presence ends, narrative fills the void. In the case of the Templars, disappearance amplified fascination. Their sudden destruction and the unresolved questions surrounding it made them ideal subjects for legend. Without clarity, the imagination becomes active. Without closure, influence continues in perception. Finally, the myths serve as an enduring invitation. They prompt inquiry, speculation, and analysis. Historians, treasure hunters, and storytellers alike are drawn to the gaps, the ambiguities, and the silences. The Templars' vanishing did not end curiosity. It redirected it. By surviving in story, the Order achieved a form of immortality that eludes many institutions far more powerful in their time. In this way, myths are not merely embellishment. They are a medium of survival. They carry lessons about strategy, morality, and adaptability. They preserve memory where archives fail. They ensure that an order destroyed in body continues to live in thought, imagination, and culture. The Knights Templar, though formally eradicated, therefore persisted in two intertwined forms: the practical diffusion of knowledge and systems, and the enduring power of narrative. The legends of vanished ships, hidden treasures, and secret knowledge are not simply fanciful tales. They are evidence of a cultural persistence that mirrors and reinforces the Order's operational resilience. Through myth, the Templars continue to shape perception, imagination, and understanding, proving that influence can survive far beyond the reach of official condemnation. Even as the centuries passed, the question of what became of the Templars' vanished ships continued to captivate scholars, treasure hunters, and storytellers alike. Unlike the tangible assets and lands of the Order, which could be catalogued, seized, or absorbed into other institutions, the fate of the fleet remained shrouded in uncertainty. The ships themselves, and whatever cargo or passengers they may have carried, vanished into history almost without a trace. Yet in this very absence lies the essence of the mystery, a subtle testament to the Order's enduring strategy of adaptation and survival. Medieval maritime travel was complex and perilous. Ships were subject to storms, shifting currents, navigational errors, and piracy. Yet the Templars were not inexperienced seafarers. By the late 13th century, they had developed significant naval expertise, managing fleets not only to transport supplies and personnel to the Holy Land, but also to maintain communication between commanderies across Europe. Their logistical acumen, honed over decades, suggests that the disappearance of the ships was unlikely to be accidental. Rather, it appears to have been a calculated maneuver, executed with precision and forethought. The Atlantic routes from France offered both opportunity and concealment. Unlike the Mediterranean, which was heavily trafficked and closely monitored, the Atlantic was less predictable and less regulated. This made it an ideal corridor for discreet movement. Ships could hug the coast, seeking ports in Portugal or the British Isles, or they could venture farther into open waters, exploiting currents and tides to remain undetected. The Templars' understanding of these routes, combined with their network of trusted sailors, would have enabled them to navigate effectively while avoiding interception. Portugal, in particular, emerges repeatedly in discussions of potential destinations. The relationship between the Templars and the Portuguese crown had long been cooperative. The Order had defended frontier territories, administered estates, and provided military and logistical expertise critical to the kingdom's security. When the Order in France faced destruction, Portugal offered a safe haven, not merely as a gesture of loyalty, but as a strategic decision to preserve valuable assets, knowledge, and personnel. The eventual creation of the Order of Christ formalized this continuity, effectively absorbing Templar resources, expertise, and even symbolic identity into a new, state-aligned institution. Scotland represents a more speculative yet intriguing possibility. At the time, Scotland was politically isolated, excommunicated, and engaged in a protracted struggle for independence. These conditions created a space in which fugitives could operate without immediate interference from papal or royal authorities. The Templars' skills in military organization, fortification, and logistics would have been highly valuable in such an environment. Legends of mysterious knights appearing in pivotal Scottish battles, while unverifiable, suggest a cultural memory of Templar involvement, or at least the perception of it. Even if these stories are embellished, they underscore the enduring idea that Templar influence could persist in remote or politically marginal regions, far from the centers of power that had sought to destroy them. The question of what these ships carried is equally important. Material wealth, gold, silver, and other treasures, has long dominated popular imagination. Yet, as historians and scholars have noted, the true value of the Templars lay less in bullion than in knowledge, records, and human capital. Documents detailing debts, financial networks, and strategic alliances would have been far more difficult to replace than chests of gold. Likewise, experienced personnel, administrators, knights, and navigators trained in the Templar system, represented a resource of incalculable value. These were the assets that could ensure continuity, even if the order's name and formal structure were eradicated. In this light, the ships may have functioned less as treasure carriers and more as vessels of continuity. They preserved knowledge, personnel, and operational capacity, allowing the Templars' methods and practices to survive in environments where formal recognition was impossible. The absence of documentation or visible treasure is consistent with this strategy. What matters for survival is not visibility but the ability to endure, adapt, and integrate quietly. The mystery is further compounded by the lack of records. Royal and papal authorities, having destroyed the order in France, had limited reach over the high seas. Shipping records were sporadic, ports were decentralized, and information was easily lost. Even if the ships had called at multiple harbors, unless explicitly observed and recorded by local authorities, their movements could have gone unnoticed. This opacity reflects both the technical limitations of the period and the deliberate operational security that the Templars had long emphasized. Over time, these absences became the foundation for legend. Tales of Templar treasure fleets lost in storms, hidden on remote islands, or sailing to undiscovered lands captured the imagination. While largely fictional, these stories are rooted in the tangible reality that something significant did vanish. Unlike lands, castles, or documented funds, the ships left no trace. Their disappearance became a canvas upon which later generations projected possibilities, fears, and ambitions. The vanishing of the ships also highlights a strategic principle. Sometimes survival requires invisibility. Unlike battles or sieges, where strength is demonstrated through presence, the Templars understood that endurance could be achieved through absence. By disappearing into the sea, they avoided confrontation, preserved resources, and maintained the potential for reemergence under new circumstances. In this sense, the fleet's disappearance was not defeat but adaptation, a deliberate choice to preserve what was most valuable under threat. Modern fascination with the Templar ships underscores the enduring tension between visibility and survival. People seek tangible artifacts, maps, or treasures as proof of continuity. Yet the Templars' real legacy challenges this assumption. Influence does not always require physical presence. Systems, knowledge, and trained individuals can persist invisibly, shaping events without announcing themselves. The vanished ships exemplify this principle, embodying the Templars' strategic understanding of risk, concealment, and long-term planning. Ultimately, the story of the missing fleet invites reflection on the nature of legacy itself. Institutions, even when formally destroyed, leave imprints that extend far beyond immediate records. The Templars' ships may have sailed into obscurity, but they carried with them the mechanisms, skills, and ideas that allowed the Order's methods to survive. In doing so, they became both literal and symbolic vessels of continuity, illustrating that disappearance need not signify defeat, and that influence can endure long after the visible traces of power have been erased. By examining the vanished ships in this broader context, one sees the Templars not merely as victims of persecution, but as masters of adaptation. Their legacy survives not in chests of gold or unbroken institutions, but in the diffusion of expertise, the preservation of operational knowledge, and the strategic choices that allowed their influence to persist quietly, invisibly, and enduringly. The ships that disappeared into history serve as a metaphor for this resilience, a testament to the Order's understanding that true survival often requires vanishing from sight, yet remaining very much alive in capacity and consequence.